Welcome, dear listener, to the intricate tapestry of three lives, bound by blood, yet divided by choice. Tonight, we chronicle the tale of the Black Sisters, Bellatrix, Andromeda, and Narcissa, daughters of one of Wizarding Britain's most ancient and noble houses. In the quiet darkness of this magical hour, let their story unfold like parchment beneath candlelight, revealing how shared ancestry can lead to vastly different destinies. Close your eyes and drift into this chronicle of sisterhood and sacrifice, where the same bloodline produced both Death Eater and hero, both darkness and light. In the heart of London, where cobbled streets wind through forgotten corners and ancient magic seeps from stones worn smooth by centuries of wizard feet, there stood a house that breathed with the weight of pure blood pride and whispered with the voices of generations long dead. Number 12. Grimold Place was more than a residence. It was a monument to wizarding nobility, a fortress of tradition, and a shrine to the belief that magical blood, when kept pure and untainted, could achieve heights that lesser lineages could never dream of touching. The noble and most ancient House of Black had occupied this shadowy dwelling for centuries, each generation adding their own layer of protective enchantments, their own portraits to the gallery of stern-faced ancestors, their own contributions to the family's growing reputation for magical excellence and unwavering dedication to the supremacy of pure-blood wizarding society. The very walls seemed to pulse with ancestral magic, thick and heavy as velvet curtains, while the air itself carried the metallic taste of spells woven so deeply into the building's structure that they had become part of its fundamental essence. The family motto, toujours pur, always pure, was carved into the marble mantelpiece of the drawing room, etched into the silver serving pieces that graced their elaborate dining table, and embroidered in golden thread upon the tapestries that depicted the family tree stretching back through centuries of careful breeding and strategic marriages. But more than mere decoration, these words were carved into the hearts and minds of every child born beneath this roof, becoming not just a motto, but a sacred commandment that would shape every decision, every relationship, every breath they drew from the moment they first opened their eyes in their ancestral home. It was into this world of privilege and prejudice, of ancient magic and newer hatreds, that three daughters were born in the 1950s, each destined to interpret their family's legacy in radically different ways. Their parents, Cygnus Black III and Druella Rosier Black, represented the perfect union of two pure bloodlines that had remained untainted by Muggle blood for so many generations, that their magical signatures carried a particular resonance that marked them as true aristocracy among wizarding kind. Cygnus was a man molded by tradition, his every gesture refined by centuries of breeding, his every word chosen with the careful precision of someone who understood that language was power, and power was responsibility. He had inherited not just his father's fortune and position, but his father's absolute conviction that wizard society was meant to be hierarchical, with purebloods at its apex, and lesser magical beings arranged in descending order according to the purity of their bloodlines and the strength of their magical gifts. His wife, Druella, brought to the marriage not just her own impeccable lineage, but connections to some of the most influential dark wizarding families in Europe. The Rosier name was whispered in certain circles with a mixture of respect and fear, as they were known for producing witches and wizards whose magical abilities pushed the boundaries of what was considered safe or legal. She was a woman of sharp intelligence and sharper ambitions, understanding that the world was changing around them, and that maintaining pure-blood supremacy would require more than mere tradition. It would require active effort, and, when necessary, active resistance to the growing influence of Muggle-born wizards and their sympathizers. Their first daughter arrived on a winter morning when snow fell like ash over London, and the very air seemed to crackle with malevolent potential. They named her Bellatrix, after the warrior star that blazed in the constellation of Orion, and from her earliest moments, she seemed to embody everything fierce and untamable about her stellar namesake. Even as an infant, there was something unsettling about the intensity of her gaze. The way her dark eyes seemed to take in everything around her with an hunger that went beyond mere curiosity. She was a beautiful child, blessed with the classical features that marked the black bloodline, aristocratic cheekbones that could cut glass, hair so dark it seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it, and a natural grace that spoke of generations of selective breeding for both magical power and physical perfection. But beneath this beauty lay something that made visitors uncomfortable, a quality of barely restrained wildness that suggested she was capable of anything if properly motivated. Her magical abilities manifested early and dramatically. At 18 months, she reduced a crystal goblet to powder simply by staring at it with sufficient intensity. At 2 years, she made her nursery curtains burst into flames because she disliked their color. By 3, she was levitating objects with casual ease, her infant magic responding to her emotions with a directness that both thrilled and concerned her parents. Here was power, raw and undisciplined, but unmistakably potent. 2 years later, their second daughter was born during a spring storm that rattled the windows of Grimmauld Place and filled the house with the electric tension that preceded lightning. They named her Andromeda, after the constellation princess who had been chained to the rocks as sacrifice but ultimately saved through love and courage. The choice of name would prove more prophetic than either parent could have imagined at the time. Where Bellatrix had been fierce from birth, Andromeda was contemplative, her infant gaze following the movements of adults with a thoughtful attention that suggested she was analyzing rather than simply observing. She was as beautiful as her older sister, but in a softer way, her features carrying the same aristocratic perfection but tempered with something gentler, more accessible. Her magical manifestations were subtler too, flowers that bloomed out of season in her presence, injured birds that healed when she touched them, a general sense of harmony that seemed to emanate from her very being. But even in childhood, there were signs that Andromeda saw the world differently than her family expected. She asked questions that made her parents uncomfortable. Why were house elves treated as slaves rather than employees? Why were Muggle-born wizards considered inferior when their magic worked just as well? Why were werewolves and other magical creatures denied basic rights and protections? These questions were discouraged, but they revealed a mind that refused to accept tradition simply because it was traditional. The youngest daughter arrived 2 years after Andromeda, born on a clear autumn day when the light streaming through the windows of Grimmauld Place seemed to illuminate everything with unusual clarity and warmth. They named her Narcissa, after the flower that symbolized rebirth and transformation, though in the language of mythology, it also carried darker connotations of vanity and self-obsession that would prove equally relevant to her character. Narcissa combined the best physical attributes of both her sisters, Bellatrix's striking beauty and Andromeda's softer appeal, but added to them a quality of perfection that seemed almost artificial in its completeness. Her hair was so pale it was nearly white, her skin so flawless it might have been carved from marble, her features so symmetrical they could have served as the model for classical statuary. But beyond physical beauty, she possessed an intelligence that was both sharp and calculating, understanding from an early age that beauty was power when properly deployed, and that power was the key to getting everything she wanted. Her magic manifested in ways that revealed her fundamental nature, always controlled, always purposeful, always designed to achieve specific ends, rather than expressing raw emotion. She could charm adults into giving her anything she desired, make her toys rearrange themselves according to her preferences, even influence the weather around the house to suit her moods. But unlike her sister's dramatic magical outbursts, Narcissa's abilities were subtle and sophisticated, revealing a mind that understood strategy and patience better than most adults. The three girls grew up in an atmosphere of wealth that was so complete it was almost suffocating. Their wardrobes were filled with robes made from fabrics that cost more than most wizarding families earned in a year. Their toys were crafted by master artisans and enhanced with magic that made them more entertaining than anything available to ordinary children. Their meals were prepared by house elves whose families had served the blacks for generations, creating elaborate feasts that would have been appropriate for visiting dignitaries rather than everyday family dining. But beneath this luxury lay an education in prejudice that was as systematic as it was subtle. They learned from their earliest years that they were special, not just because of their family's wealth, but because of their pure magical heritage that connected them to the most ancient and powerful wizarding bloodlines in Britain. They were taught that Muggle-born wizards were thieves who had somehow stolen magic that rightfully belonged to pure-blood families, that magical creatures were lesser beings created to serve wizardkind, that the natural order of the world placed pure bloods at its apex, and everyone else in positions of appropriate subservience. These lessons were reinforced not just through direct instruction but through every aspect of their daily lives. The house elves who served them were treated as property rather than individuals, their obvious intelligence and magical abilities dismissed as mere mimicry of true wizarding greatness. Visitors to the house were carefully screened to ensure that only families with acceptable bloodlines were admitted to their social circle. Even their entertainment was chosen to reinforce these messages. Books that celebrated pure blood achievements, games that depicted Muggles as ignorant and helpless, stories that portrayed magical creatures as dangerous threats that could only be controlled through wizard dominance. The family library, which occupied an entire floor of the house, was carefully curated to support these beliefs while eliminating any materials that might encourage questioning or independent thinking. Shelves, lined with leather-bound volumes, detailed the genealogies of pure-blood families, the achievements of wizards whose bloodlines could be traced back for centuries, the theoretical foundations of blood magic and its applications. But nowhere to be found were books about Muggle achievements, works by Muggle-born authors, or any materials that suggested alternative perspectives on wizarding society's structure and values. Their extended family reinforced these lessons through regular visits and family gatherings that served as education in pure-blood social dynamics and expectations. While Burger Black, Cygnus's sister-in-law, was particularly influential in shaping the girls' understanding of their place in the world, a woman whose fanaticism made their parents seem moderate by comparison. She filled their heads with stories of pure-blood martyrs who had died rather than compromise their principles, of great wizarding families that had been destroyed by association with inferior bloodlines, of the cosmic importance of maintaining magical purity in an age when lesser beings sought to corrupt and dilute the gifts that had been granted to the worthy. Her own son, Sirius, was held up as a cautionary tale, even before he began to rebel against family expectations. His questions about pure-blood ideology, his friendships with students from less prestigious families, his reluctance to embrace the hatred that was supposed to be his birthright, all were treated as symptoms of dangerous thinking that could lead to the kind of disgrace that would destroy not just his own future, but the reputation of the entire extended family. Through these examples and countless others, the three sisters learned that their world was divided into clearly defined categories: pure bloods, who deserved respect and power, half-bloods who might be tolerated if they properly acknowledged their inferiority, and Muggle-borns who represented an existential threat to everything their family held sacred. They learned to recognize the signs of magical heritage through bloodline analysis, to understand the complex social hierarchies that governed pure-blood interactions, to speak the coded language that allowed them to communicate their beliefs without explicitly stating positions that might be considered legally or socially problematic. But even as they absorbed these lessons, the three sisters processed them in fundamentally different ways that reflected their emerging personalities and moral orientations. Bellatrix embraced the ideology with an enthusiasm that sometimes made even her parents uncomfortable, taking pride in her family's superiority and expressing contempt for lesser beings with a vehemence that went beyond mere prejudice into something approaching pathological hatred. She saw herself as a warrior in a cosmic struggle between worthy and unworthy, between pure and corrupted, between the natural order and the forces that sought to overturn it. Andromeda, by contrast, seemed increasingly troubled by what she was taught, asking questions that revealed her growing discomfort with beliefs that seemed to contradict her own observations about the world around her. She noticed that the house elves were more intelligent and capable than her parents claimed, that the Muggle-born students she occasionally encountered in Diagon Alley seemed no different from pure-blood children, that the magical creatures her family dismissed as inferior often displayed wisdom and nobility that put many wizards to shame. These observations created internal conflicts that would only intensify as she grew older and gained more exposure to the world beyond Grimmauld Place. Narcissa's response was more calculating and self-serving than either of her sisters. She understood that pure-blood ideology was the foundation of her family's power and position, and she had no interest in challenging beliefs that worked to her advantage. But her embrace of these principles was pragmatic rather than passionate, based on rational assessment of her own interests rather than emotional commitment to cosmic truth. She learned to use her family's prejudices as tools for advancing her own goals, understanding that appearing to share their beliefs completely was the key to maintaining her privileged position while pursuing her own agenda. Their childhood was structured around preparing them for the roles they would be expected to fulfill as adult members of pure-blood society. They received private tutoring in subjects that went far beyond what ordinary wizarding children learned. Advanced genealogy that allowed them to trace bloodlines back through centuries of careful breeding. Magical theory that emphasized the connections between genetic purity and magical power. Social protocols that governed interactions between families of different ranks and reputations. They learned to speak several languages, to appreciate the finest magical arts, to conduct themselves with the dignity and grace expected of their station. But perhaps most importantly, they learned to see themselves as fundamentally different from and superior to the vast majority of the wizarding population. This sense of specialness was carefully cultivated through every aspect of their upbringing, from the deference shown to them by house elves and shopkeepers, to the admiration expressed by visitors to their home, to the constant reinforcement they received about their unique heritage and the responsibilities that came with it. The three sisters played together but also competed constantly, their parents encouraging rivalry as a means of bringing out the best in each child, while ensuring that none of them became complacent about their achievements. Bellatrix excelled in magical combat exercises, demonstrating a natural talent for offensive spells and an aggressive temperament that made her formidable even as a child. Andromeda showed exceptional skill in magical theory and healing arts, her gentle nature expressing itself through abilities that helped rather than harmed. Narcissa dominated social situations, using her beauty and intelligence to manipulate adults and children alike into giving her whatever she desired. As they approached their 11th birthdays and the Hogwarts letters that would mark the next phase of their education, each sister had already begun to develop the characteristics that would define their adult lives. Bellatrix was becoming more militant in her pure-blood beliefs, more contemptuous of anyone she considered inferior, more eager to prove her superiority through demonstration of magical power. Andromeda was growing more thoughtful and questioning, more troubled by the contradictions she observed between her family's teachings and her own experiences, more drawn to ideas about equality and justice that would have horrified her parents if they had fully understood their implications. Narcissa was learning to present herself as the perfect pure-blood daughter, while privately pursuing her own interests and ambitions with single-minded determination. The house at Grimmauld Place had shaped them all, but it had not created identical copies of their parents' beliefs and values. Instead, it had provided the foundation for three very different interpretations of what it meant to be born into the noble and most ancient House of Black, setting the stage for conflicts and choices that would ultimately tear their family apart and place them on opposite sides of the greatest war the wizarding world had known for generations. The autumn of 1962 brought with it the familiar ritual that had marked the beginning of magical education for Black family children for countless generations. Bellatrix, now 11 years old and possessed of a confidence that bordered on arrogance, stood in the entrance hall of Grimmauld Place, wearing robes that had been tailored to perfection and carrying a trunk that contained not just the standard Hogwarts requirements, but additional books on advanced magical theory that her parents deemed essential for a child of her breeding. Her wand, 11 inches of walnut with a dragon heartstring core, had chosen her at Ollivanders with a burst of golden sparks that the wandmaker had declared particularly auspicious for someone destined for greatness. The journey to Hogwarts was her first real exposure to wizarding children from backgrounds other than the carefully curated pure-blood families that frequented her parents' social gatherings. The Hogwarts Express carried students from every level of magical society, from the children of ancient families like her own to the sons and daughters of shopkeepers, ministry workers, and even, though this fact was whispered rather than spoken aloud, Muggle-born witches and wizards whose very presence on the train struck her as a contamination of what should have been a sacred journey. She found herself sharing a compartment with Rodolphus Lestrange, whose family's reputation for dark magic and unwavering pure-blood loyalty made him an acceptable companion in her parents' estimation. He was a year older than she, already experienced in the ways of Hogwarts, and possessed of the kind of casual cruelty that she found both familiar and comforting. Their conversation during the long journey north was filled with dismissive comments about the inferior breeding of their fellow passengers, speculations about which students would prove worthy of their attention, and shared anticipation of the moment when the Sorting Hat would confirm what they already knew, that they belonged in Slytherin House, where ambition and cunning were valued above the softer virtues that lesser students might possess. The sorting ceremony that evening unfolded exactly as Bellatrix had expected. The ancient hat had barely touched her head before declaring her a Slytherin, its decision so immediate and certain that it seemed to validate everything she had been taught about her natural superiority and destined greatness. She took her place at the green and silver table with the satisfaction of someone whose expectations had been met completely, surrounded by students whose names she recognized from her parents' careful instruction in pure-blood genealogy and social hierarchies. Her first years at Hogwarts were marked by academic excellence that came as naturally as breathing and social dominance that she wielded with increasing sophistication. She excelled particularly in defense against the dark arts, where her aggressive temperament and natural magical power combined to produce spell work that impressed even professors who had seen decades of talented students. But more than mere academic achievement, she demonstrated an intuitive understanding of the darker aspects of magic that went beyond what could be learned from textbooks or classroom instruction. Her friendship circle formed around students whose backgrounds and beliefs aligned with her own, children of Death Eaters, and dark magic practitioners who shared her contempt for Muggle-born students and her conviction that wizarding society was meant to be hierarchical, with pure bloods at its apex and lesser beings arranged in appropriate positions of subservience. These relationships were more than mere social connections, but the foundations of what would eventually become a network of adult collaborators in activities that would challenge every principle of civilized magical society. Rodolphus Lestrange quickly became her closest male companion, though their relationship was based more on shared ideology and mutual usefulness than genuine affection. He was intelligent enough to appreciate her magical abilities and ambitious enough to recognize the advantages that came with association to someone of her family's standing. She, in turn, valued his connections to other dark wizarding families and his willingness to support her increasingly extreme interpretations of pure blood supremacy doctrine. But it was her relationship with Professor Horace Slughorn that revealed the full extent of her calculating nature and her ability to manipulate adults when it served her purposes. Slughorn, the potions master and head of Slytherin House, was known for his preference for students from prominent families and his tendency to provide special attention and opportunities to those he deemed worthy of inclusion in his exclusive social circle. Bellatrix understood instinctively that gaining his favor would provide her with access to advanced magical knowledge and influential connections that could prove invaluable in pursuing her long-term goals. She attended his informal gatherings with the charm and grace that had been drilled into her since childhood, demonstrating just enough intellectual curiosity to flatter his ego while carefully avoiding any topics that might reveal the true extremity of her beliefs about magical hierarchy and the proper treatment of inferior beings. In these settings, she learned to present herself as merely a bright and ambitious student rather than someone whose ultimate goals went far beyond academic achievement into realms that would have alarmed even professors who were sympathetic to traditional, pure-blood values. 2 years after Bellatrix's sorting, Andromeda arrived at Hogwarts, carrying the same expectations and bearing the same family name, but possessed of a fundamentally different temperament that would lead her down paths that her older sister could never have imagined following. The Sorting Hat's decision to place her in Slytherin was based more on her family heritage and magical ability than her personal inclinations, which already showed signs of diverging from the beliefs that had shaped her early education. Where Bellatrix had embraced Hogwarts as validation of everything she had been taught about her natural superiority, Andromeda experienced it as revelation about the diversity and complexity of the magical world beyond Grimmauld Place. For the first time in her life, she was exposed to students whose backgrounds and experiences differed radically from her own, and she discovered that many of her family's teachings about the inferiority of Muggle-born wizards were contradicted by the evidence of her own observations. She found herself particularly drawn to students from Ravenclaw and Hufflepuff houses, whose values and interests aligned more closely with her own developing sense of justice and equality than the ambition and cunning that supposedly defined Slytherin excellence. These friendships were conducted with the discretion necessary to avoid attracting negative attention from her housemates or disapproval from professors who expected students from prominent pure-blood families to maintain appropriate social boundaries. Her academic performance was exceptional, but in different areas than her sister's achievements had emphasized. Where Bellatrix excelled in combat magic and defensive spells, Andromeda showed particular talent in healing arts, transfiguration, and magical theory that focused on protection rather than aggression. Her essays consistently earned outstanding marks, not just for their technical competence, but for their innovative approaches to complex problems, and their demonstration of original thinking that went beyond mere repetition of established doctrine. But perhaps most significantly, she began to question assumptions about magical society that her family considered fundamental and unquestionable. Her observations of Muggle-born students revealed that their magical abilities were often superior to those of pure-blood students, that their knowledge and skills developed just as rapidly and comprehensively, and that their character and values were frequently more admirable than those displayed by students from supposedly superior bloodlines. These realizations created internal conflicts that intensified as she progressed through her years at Hogwarts. She found herself increasingly unable to reconcile her family's teachings with her own experiences, increasingly troubled by the casual cruelty that her housemates displayed towards students they considered inferior, increasingly drawn to ideas about equality and justice that would have horrified her parents if they had fully understood their implications. Her relationship with Bellatrix became strained as their ideological differences became more apparent. Where once they had been close sisters who shared everything, they now found themselves on opposite sides of debates about fundamental questions of right and wrong, justice and tradition, progress and preservation. Bellatrix viewed her sister's evolving beliefs as evidence of dangerous thinking that could bring disgrace upon their entire family, while Andromeda saw her older sister's extremism as a betrayal of everything noble and worthwhile about their magical heritage. The arrival of Narcissa at Hogwarts 2 years after Andromeda added a third perspective to the family dynamics that were already becoming complicated by ideological differences and conflicting loyalties. The youngest black sister brought with her an approach to pure blood ideology that was more pragmatic than passionate, more calculated than emotional, more focused on personal advantage than cosmic truth. Like her sisters before her, Narcissa was sorted into Slytherin without hesitation, her magical abilities and family background making her an obvious fit for a house that valued ambition and cunning above other virtues. But her approach to Hogwarts life differed significantly from either of her sisters' strategies, reflecting a personality that was fundamentally self-serving rather than ideologically driven. She recognized immediately that her beauty was a weapon that could be deployed with devastating effectiveness in achieving her goals, and she learned to use it with a sophistication that impressed even older students who had more experience in social manipulation. Her charm was natural, but enhanced through careful study of what different people wanted to hear, what weaknesses could be exploited, what desires could be cultivated and then satisfied in exchange for favors and advantages. Her academic work was consistently excellent, but never passionate, reflecting an intelligence that was sharp and focused, but primarily directed toward practical rather than theoretical concerns. She understood instinctively that knowledge was power only when it could be applied to achieve specific objectives, and she chose her areas of study accordingly, focusing on subjects that would enhance her social position and marriage prospects, rather than pursuing intellectual curiosity for its own sake. But perhaps most importantly, she developed a reputation for loyalty to her friends and ruthlessness toward her enemies that made her both a valuable ally and a dangerous opponent. Students learned quickly that crossing Narcissa Black carried consequences that went far beyond immediate retaliation, as she possessed both the patience to wait for perfect opportunities for revenge and the connections necessary to ensure that her enemies suffered in ways that couldn't be traced back to her directly. Her relationship with her sisters during their overlapping years at Hogwarts revealed the growing complexity of family dynamics that were being shaped by exposure to ideas and experiences that their parents had never anticipated or prepared them to handle. With Bellatrix, she maintained a careful balance of apparent agreement with her older sister's extremist views, while privately pursuing a more moderate approach that focused on personal advancement rather than ideological purity. With Andromeda, Her interactions were more complex and ultimately more honest, as she recognized in her middle sister someone whose intelligence matched her own, but whose moral development was proceeding in directions that could prove either advantageous or dangerous, depending on how events unfolded. She neither encouraged nor discouraged Andromeda's growing sympathy for Muggle-born students and progressive ideas about magical society, understanding that maintaining neutrality in family conflicts was often the most advantageous position. The three sisters' different approaches to their Hogwarts education reflected not just their individual personalities, but their developing understanding of how they intended to position themselves in the adult magical world that awaited them beyond the castle walls. Bellatrix saw herself as a warrior in a cosmic struggle between worthy and unworthy, preparing for battles that would determine the future of magical civilization itself. Andromeda was evolving into someone who valued justice and equality above family loyalty and traditional hierarchies, though she had not yet fully acknowledged the implications of these developing beliefs. Narcissa was learning to navigate complex social and political realities with the goal of maximizing her own advantages while minimizing unnecessary risks. Their academic achievements during these years reflected these different orientations and priorities. Bellatrix's exceptional performance in defense against the dark arts was matched by her growing interest in subjects that were not part of the official Hogwarts curriculum: dark magic theory, curse development, and magical combat techniques that pushed the boundaries of what was considered appropriate for student study. Her essays and practical work consistently demonstrated not just technical competence, but creative applications of magical principles that sometimes alarmed professors who recognized the potential for such knowledge to be used for purposes that went far beyond academic exercise. Andromeda's academic excellence was more broadly distributed across subjects, reflecting intellectual curiosity that was genuine rather than strategic. Her work in Transfiguration earned praise from Professor McGonagall for its precision and innovation. Her potions assignments impressed even Professor Slughorn with their technical sophistication and creative problem-solving. But it was her performance in subjects like Muggle studies and care of magical creatures that most clearly revealed her evolving worldview and growing sympathy for beings that her family considered inferior. Narcissa's academic record was consistently outstanding but carefully calibrated to maintain her social position without attracting unwanted attention from professors or parents who might question her motivations or methods. She excelled in subjects that enhanced her reputation as the perfect pure-blood daughter: ancient runes, arithmancy, and advanced potions work that demonstrated both intelligence and dedication to traditional magical arts. But she avoided areas of study that might be considered controversial or that could create conflicts with her family's expectations about appropriate interests for a young woman of her breeding. The extracurricular activities that the three sisters pursued during their Hogwarts years further revealed their diverging paths and developing priorities. Bellatrix gravitated toward activities that allowed her to demonstrate her magical superiority and leadership potential, serving as a prefect, organizing study groups for advanced defense against the dark arts techniques, and participating in informal dueling clubs where students could practice combat magic under minimal supervision. But her most significant activities were those that took place outside official school channels, in secret meetings with students who shared her extremist views about pure-blood supremacy and the necessity of taking direct action to preserve magical civilization from contamination by inferior beings. These gatherings began as informal discussions about magical theory and family traditions, but gradually evolved into something approaching political organizing as participants developed increasingly detailed plans for how they would work to implement their beliefs in the adult world that awaited them beyond Hogwarts. Andromeda's extracurricular interests reflected her growing commitment to ideals that would have scandalized her family if they had fully understood their implications. She participated in informal study groups that focused on progressive approaches to magical law and governance, volunteered to help younger students who were struggling academically regardless of their blood status or family background, and spent increasing amounts of her free time in the Hogwarts library researching subjects that were not part of any official curriculum, but that helped her understand alternative perspectives on magical society and its proper organization. Her most significant relationship during these years was with Tonks, a Hufflepuff student whose Muggle-born status made him exactly the kind of person her family would have forbidden her to associate with if they had known about their growing friendship. Their relationship began as academic collaboration on projects that crossed house boundaries, but gradually developed into something deeper and more personal as they discovered shared values and complementary personalities that transcended the artificial barriers created by blood status and family. Prejudices. Narcissa's extracurricular activities were chosen with the same strategic calculation that guided her academic work, designed to enhance her social position and marriage prospects while avoiding any associations that might create problems with her family or her future plans. She participated in activities that showcased her talents and connections, organizing social events for Slytherin House, serving in leadership roles that demonstrated her ability to manage complex projects and difficult personalities, and maintaining friendships with students from prominent pure-blood families who would become valuable connections in her adult life. Her most significant relationship during these years was with Lucius Malfoy, a student several years ahead of her, whose family's wealth and influence made him an ideal match according to pure-blood marriage traditions. Their courtship was conducted with the formal elegance that their families expected, but it was based on genuine mutual attraction and shared goals rather than mere obligation or convenience. The final years of their Hogwarts education brought increasingly difficult choices and clearer definitions of where each sister stood on the fundamental questions that were beginning to divide the magical world. The rise of Lord Voldemort, though still largely hidden from public awareness, was already creating ripples throughout wizarding society that reached even into the supposedly protected environment of Hogwarts School. Bellatrix found herself increasingly drawn to rumors and whispered conversations about a powerful wizard who shared her beliefs about pure blood supremacy and was taking direct action to implement those beliefs through methods that went far beyond political organization or social pressure. The idea of joining a movement that could transform magical society according to principles she had believed in since childhood held enormous appeal, representing not just ideological alignment, but the opportunity to prove herself worthy of greatness through service to a cause larger than individual ambition. Andromeda faced the growing recognition that her evolving beliefs about equality and justice put her on a collision course with everything her family expected of her and everything her social position was supposed to represent. Her relationship with Tonks had deepened into love that transcended the barriers created by blood status and family prejudice, but pursuing that love would require choices that could cost her everything she had known about her identity and place in the world. Narcissa navigated these turbulent currents with the careful calculation that had always characterized her approach to complex situations, understanding that the decisions she made in the coming years would determine not just her own future, but the future of any children she might have, and the legacy she would leave for future generations. Her relationship with Lucius provided stability and advantages that aligned with her family's expectations, but it also connected her to networks and influences that might eventually require her to choose between personal safety and family loyalty. As their Hogwarts years drew to a close, The three black sisters stood at the threshold of adult decisions that would define their characters and determine their fates in ways that none of them could fully anticipate. The education they had received, both from their family and from their experiences at school, had prepared them with knowledge and skills that would serve them well in whatever paths they chose to follow. But it had also revealed fundamental differences in their values and priorities that would ultimately place them on opposite sides of conflicts that would test every assumption about loyalty, duty, and the proper ordering of the magical world. The young women who prepared to leave Hogwarts were no longer simply the three daughters of Cygnus and Druella Black, shaped entirely by their families' expectations and traditions. They had become individuals with their own beliefs, their own goals, their own understanding of what it meant to possess magical power and pure blood heritage in a world that was changing in ways that would challenge everything they had been taught to value and believe. The transition from Hogwarts students to adult members of Wizarding Society marked the beginning of the most crucial period in the lives of the three black sisters, as the theoretical beliefs and developing personalities that had shaped their school years were tested against the practical realities of marriage, family obligations, and the increasingly dangerous political climate that was beginning to divide the magical world into irreconcilable camps. The choices they made during these formative years would determine not only their own fates, but the legacy they would leave for future generations. Bellatrix was the first to marry, her union with Rodolphus Lestrange taking place in the summer of 1970 during a ceremony that epitomized everything grand and terrible about pure-blood wedding traditions. The event was held at the ancestral Lestrange estate, a Gothic monstrosity that had been built during the 14th century and enhanced over the centuries with defensive enchantments and architectural modifications that reflected each generation's increasing paranoia about external threats to their accumulated wealth and social position. The ceremony itself was conducted according to rituals that dated back centuries, incorporating magical elements that bound the couple not just legally but spiritually, creating connections between their magical cores that would persist until death dissolved the bonds, through the ultimate separation that no spell could prevent or overcome. Ancient goblets carved from dragon bone held wine that had been enhanced with potions designed to ensure fertility and magical compatibility. Rings forged from gold that had been mined by goblins and cursed to bring misfortune to anyone who removed them without proper authorization were exchanged, while hundreds of guests who represented the cream of pure blood society bore witness to vows that emphasized duty and bloodline, preservation above personal happiness or romantic attachment. But those who observed the bride closely during the ceremony noted that her attention seemed to wander at crucial moments, as if the ritual that was supposed to represent the most important day of her life held less significance for her than other matters that occupied her thoughts and commanded her true loyalty. When she spoke her vows, the words seemed to emerge from her lips without genuine feeling, mere recitation of phrases that tradition demanded, but that held no real meaning for someone whose heart was already given to causes that transcended personal relationships and individual desires. The marriage was, from its very beginning, nothing more than a practical arrangement designed to satisfy family expectations and maintain the social connections that pure-blood families considered essential for preserving their position in Wizarding society. Rodolphus Lestrange was an acceptable husband according to every criterion that mattered to the Black family. His bloodline was impeccable, his family's wealth was substantial, his political beliefs aligned perfectly with their own convictions about the proper ordering of magical society, and his willingness to defer to his wife's stronger personality ensured that the marriage would not interfere with her pursuit of more important goals. But for Bellatrix herself, the marriage was merely a legal formality that provided her with the social status necessary to move freely in the circles where real power was being concentrated and real decisions were being made about the future of wizarding, civilization. Her husband was useful as a companion in activities that required male participation, as a source of additional financial resources, when her own inheritance proved insufficient for her purposes, and as a shield against questions about her personal life that might otherwise have drawn unwanted attention from family members or ministry officials who were beginning to monitor the activities of certain prominent pure-blood families. The couple's public appearances together were marked by a coldness that was apparent even to casual observers, though those who knew them well understood that this distance reflected not marital discord, but mutual recognition that their partnership was based on shared ideology rather than personal affection. They attended social events together with the mechanical precision of people performing a duty rather than enjoying an entertainment. Their conversations with other guests focused entirely on political matters and social connections that could advance their mutual goals, rather than the personal topics that typically occupied married couples in social settings. More tellingly, Bellatrix never bore her husband a child, a circumstance that was unusual enough among pure-blood families to generate whispered speculation about whether the failure was due to magical incompatibility, deliberate prevention, or simply the natural result of a relationship that was conducted with such emotional coldness that genuine intimacy was impossible. The truth, for those perceptive enough to understand it, was that Bellatrix had no interest in dividing her attention between maternal duties and the consuming passion that increasingly dominated her thoughts and shaped her actions. That passion was reserved entirely for Lord Voldemort, whose name was still whispered rather than spoken aloud in most circles, but whose influence was growing throughout the magical world like a poison that seeped into every corner of pure-blood society. Her devotion to him transcended anything that could be called normal political support or ideological alignment, approaching instead the kind of fanatical worship that was typically reserved for religious figures or mythological heroes, rather than living wizards whose goals and methods could be observed and evaluated through rational analysis. Her obsession with Voldemort manifested in countless ways that revealed the depth of her emotional and spiritual commitment to his cause. She studied his publicly known writings and speeches with the dedication of a scholar preparing for advanced examinations, memorizing not just his words but his gestures, his inflections, his methods of persuasion and intimidation. She arranged her daily schedule around opportunities to attend events where he might appear or where his followers gathered to discuss his teachings and plan their implementation. Most significantly, she began to modify her own magical practices to align more closely with his known preferences and techniques, studying dark magic not just as an intellectual exercise but as a form of worship that demonstrated her worthiness to serve his greater purposes. The second sister to marry was Narcissa, whose union with Lucius Malfoy took place 2 years after Bellatrix's wedding during a ceremony that was equally grand, but conducted with an entirely different emotional atmosphere that reflected the genuine affection that existed between the bride and groom. Where Bellatrix's wedding had been a cold fulfillment of social obligation, Narcissa's marriage represented the successful culmination of a courtship that had been both strategically advantageous and personally satisfying to both participants. The Malfoy family's wealth exceeded even that of the Blacks, accumulated over centuries of shrewd investments, political influence, and carefully managed marriages that had consolidated resources while expanding social connections throughout the upper echelons of magical society. Their ancestral manor was a testament to refined taste and unlimited resources, its rooms filled with artifacts that represented the finest achievements of magical craftsmanship, and its grounds landscaped with plants and creatures that existed nowhere else in Britain, due to the expense and expertise required for their maintenance. Lucius himself was everything that Narcissa could have wanted in a husband, according to both practical and romantic criteria. His intelligence matched her own. His ambition complemented her goals. His social position enhanced her status, while her beauty and connections advanced his political aspirations. More importantly, he genuinely appreciated her for qualities that went beyond mere physical attractiveness, recognizing in her a partner whose judgment and strategic thinking could prove invaluable in navigating the complex challenges that awaited ambitious pureblood families in an increasingly dangerous world. Their courtship had been conducted with the formal elegance that their families expected, but it was based on genuine mutual attraction and shared understanding of what they wanted to achieve together as a married couple. They discussed politics with the sophistication of seasoned diplomats, planned their future with the methodical precision of military strategists, and discovered in each other intellectual equals who could challenge and stimulate each other's thinking, while maintaining the harmony necessary for a successful partnership. The wedding ceremony itself was a masterpiece of magical pageantry and social theatre, attended by hundreds of guests who represented not just the cream of pure-blood society, but the political and economic elite of magical Britain. The vows they exchanged emphasized partnership and mutual support rather than mere duty and obligation, while the magical rituals that bound them together were designed to enhance their combined abilities and create synergies that would make them more effective as a team than either could be individually. Their early married life was marked by the kind of domestic happiness that was rare among arranged marriages within pure-blood families, as they discovered that their strategic partnership was enhanced by genuine, emotional compatibility and mutual respect that deepened over time. They entertained regularly and elegantly, using their social gatherings to build networks of influence and obligation that would serve their long-term goals while enjoying the process of establishing themselves as one of magical Britain's premier power couples. The birth of their son Draco in 1980 marked the completion of Narcissa's transformation from promising young woman to fulfilled wife and mother, as she discovered in motherhood a source of joy and purpose that exceeded even her considerable ambitions for social and political advancement. The child was everything she could have hoped for: healthy, intelligent, magically powerful, and possessed of the classical Malfoy features that marked him as unmistakably pure-blood nobility. Her devotion to her son was immediate and absolute, representing the first time in her adult life that emotional attachment took precedence over strategic calculation in determining her priorities and choices. She supervised every aspect of his early care and education with the kind of obsessive attention to detail that she had previously reserved for her own advancement, ensuring that he received not just the finest tutoring and cultural exposure that money could buy, but the emotional security that came from knowing he was genuinely loved and valued for his own sake, rather than merely as a continuation of family bloodlines. But the most dramatic and consequential marriage among the three sisters was that of Andromeda, whose union with Tonks represented not just personal choice, but ideological revolution that challenged every assumption about pure-blood superiority and family loyalty that had shaped her upbringing. The decision to marry a Muggle-born wizard was not made lightly or impulsively, but represented the culmination of years of internal struggle between family obligations and personal convictions that had been developing since her earliest days at Hogwarts. Tonks was everything that her family had taught her to despise and avoid. A wizard whose magical abilities came from no discernible hereditary source, whose parents were ordinary muggles with no understanding of the magical world their son had entered, whose social position was determined entirely by his own achievements, rather than inherited advantages that marked him as naturally superior to lesser beings. According to every criterion that mattered to pure-blood ideology, he was exactly the kind of person whose very existence represented a threat to the natural order that had elevated families like the Blacks to positions of authority and influence. But Andromeda had learned through years of careful observation and honest self-reflection that the criteria her family used to evaluate worth and potential were fundamentally flawed, based on prejudices and assumptions that could not survive contact with actual evidence about how magical ability worked and what qualities truly determined a person's character and capabilities. Ted's intelligence, integrity, and genuine goodness exceeded that of most pure-blood wizards she had known, while his magical abilities were not only equal to her own, but demonstrated the kind of creative innovation that suggested natural talent rather than mere learned technique. Their courtship was conducted in secret, hidden from family members and social connections, who would have been scandalized by the very idea that a Black daughter could seriously consider marrying someone so far beneath her station. They met in places where they were unlikely to encounter anyone from her usual social circles, communicated through methods that could not be easily traced or monitored, and developed their relationship with the care and patience that forbidden love required for survival in a world that was actively hostile to their union. The decision to marry required Andromeda to choose between everything she had been given by birth and everything she had discovered through experience about what truly mattered in determining the worth of a life and the value of a relationship. Her family's wealth and social position, the connections and opportunities that came with the Black name, the security and comfort that pure blood status provided in a society organized around blood hierarchy, all would be forfeit if she chose to follow her heart rather than her family's expectations. The ceremony itself was small and private, attended only by a handful of friends who supported their decision and understood the courage it required to defy not just family expectations, but the broader social pressures that made such marriages scandalous and difficult. They exchanged vows that emphasized love and equality rather than duty and hierarchy, promising to support each other through whatever challenges their choice would bring while building a life together based on shared values rather than inherited advantages. The immediate consequence of her marriage was complete rejection by her family, who viewed her decision as not just personal betrayal but existential threat to everything they believed about the importance of blood purity and the dangers of allowing inferior beings to contaminate superior bloodlines. The formal disownment was conducted with the same ritualistic precision that marked all significant Black family actions, as her name was burned from the family tree tapestry that hung in the drawing room at Grimold Place, and all portraits, documents, and other traces of her existence were removed from the family home. The emotional impact of this rejection was devastating but not unexpected, as Andromeda had understood from the beginning that choosing Ted would cost her everything connected to her birth family and childhood home. The loss of her sister's companionship was particularly painful, as their relationships had been among the most important connections in her life, despite their growing ideological differences and conflicting loyalties. Bellatrix's reaction was characteristically extreme, viewing her sister's marriage as confirmation of dangerous thinking that could spread like a contagion throughout pure-blood society if it were not thoroughly condemned and punished. She spoke of Andromeda in terms usually reserved for traitors and criminals, expressing not just disappointment, but active hatred for someone who had chosen to align herself with forces that threatened everything their family represented and valued. Narcissa's response was more measured, but equally final, as she understood that maintaining any relationship with her disowned sister would compromise her own social position and create problems for her husband's political ambitions. She expressed private regret about the necessity of severing family ties, but made it clear that Andromeda's choices had made continued sisterhood impossible, given the broader implications for family reputation and social standing. The early years of Andromeda's marriage were marked by financial struggle and social isolation that contrasted sharply with the lives of comfort and influence that her sisters enjoyed. But they were also characterized by emotional fulfillment and moral satisfaction that neither Bellatrix nor Narcissa could claim to experience in their own marriages. Ted's love provided her with security that was deeper and more meaningful than anything money or social position could offer, while their shared commitment to equality and justice gave their relationship a purpose that transcended personal happiness or material success. The birth of their daughter Nymphadora in 1973 marked the beginning of a new phase in Andromeda's life, as she discovered in motherhood the same consuming love that had driven Narcissa's devotion to Draco, but without the complications that came from trying to raise a child within the constraints of pure blood ideology and social expectations. Her daughter would grow up understanding that worth was determined by character and actions, rather than bloodline and inheritance, that magical ability was a gift to be used in service of others, rather than a mark of superiority that justified contempt for lesser beings. The parallel development of cousins who would never know each other except as enemies on opposite sides of a war revealed the full extent of how different choices by their mothers had created entirely different paths for the next generation. Draco Malfoy grew up surrounded by luxury and privilege, his every want anticipated and satisfied by house elves and devoted parents, who saw in him the continuation of everything they valued about pure blood civilization. But he also grew up isolated from the broader magical world by assumptions about his natural superiority that prevented him from forming genuine relationships with anyone outside his narrow social circle. Nymphadora Tonks, by contrast, grew up with fewer material advantages but greater emotional security, knowing that she was loved unconditionally rather than valued primarily as the continuation of family bloodlines and traditions. Her magical abilities, which included the rare gift of Metamorph Magus transformation, were celebrated as wonderful talents rather than marks of superiority over less gifted individuals. Most importantly, she learned from her earliest years that the magical world was vast and diverse, filled with people whose worth could not be determined by their ancestry or social position. The isolation between the three sisters deepened during these years as their different choices created increasingly incompatible lifestyles and worldviews that made meaningful communication impossible, even if family pride had not prevented it. Bellatrix's growing involvement with Death Eater activities made her increasingly dangerous to be around, while Narcissa's social position required her to maintain distance from anyone whose reputation might compromise her family's standing. Andromeda's commitment to equality and justice put her on a collision course with everything her birth family represented, making reconciliation impossible, as long as any of them maintained their current beliefs and allegiances. The three women who had once shared everything, childhood games, family traditions, dreams about their future lives, had become strangers whose paths would cross again only in conflict. Their different interpretations of what their pure blood heritage meant and required having led them to positions that were not merely different but actively opposed. The bonds of sisterhood that had once seemed unbreakable had proven less durable than the ideological differences that divided their world into camps that could neither coexist peacefully nor find common ground through negotiation or compromise. As the 1970s progressed and the magical world moved inexorably toward open warfare, The three Black Sisters found themselves representing three different responses to the crisis that was engulfing their society. Bellatrix had chosen fanatical devotion to a leader who promised to restore pure blood supremacy through methods that abandoned any pretense of civilized restraint. Narcissa had chosen strategic accommodation with forces she could not control while protecting her immediate family through careful political maneuvering. Andromeda had chosen moral resistance based on principles that put her in direct opposition to everything her family had taught her to value and believe. Their marriages had been more than personal relationships but political alliances that determined not just their own fates but the destinies of their children and the legacy they would leave for future generations. The choices they had made during these crucial years would shape everything that followed, creating dynamics that would play out in ways none of them could fully anticipate, but all would be forced to live with, until the final resolution of conflicts that were already too deep and too fundamental to be resolved through anything less than complete victory by one side or the other. The summer of 1979 marked the beginning of the most terrible period in the modern history of wizarding Britain, as Lord Voldemort's influence spread like a malignant curse through every corner of magical society, transforming neighbors into enemies and families into battlegrounds, where the most fundamental questions about justice and power would be decided through violence rather than debate. For the three Black Sisters, this escalation of conflict would test every belief they held and every choice they had made, forcing them to confront the ultimate consequences of the paths they had chosen during their marriages and early adult years. Bellatrix embraced the coming war with an enthusiasm that frightened even those who shared her beliefs about pure blood supremacy and the necessity of eliminating inferior beings from magical society. Her devotion to Lord Voldemort had evolved from ideological alignment into something approaching religious fanaticism, as she found in his leadership not just political direction, but spiritual purpose that gave meaning to every aspect of her existence and justified any action taken in service of his greater vision for wizarding civilization. Her formal initiation into the Death Eaters was conducted in a ceremony that combined ancient dark magic with modern innovations in magical binding, creating connections between her magical core and Voldemort's will that transcended normal concepts of loyalty or obedience. The dark mark that was burned into her left forearm was more than mere identification, but a permanent channel through which her master could summon her, monitor her activities, and if necessary, punish her for any failure or disloyalty that threatened his plans or challenged his authority. But for Bellatrix, the mark was not a burden but a badge of honor that demonstrated her worthiness to serve the most powerful wizard who had ever lived, proof that she had been chosen for greatness and granted the privilege of participating in the transformation of magical society according to principles that would elevate the worthy and eliminate the unworthy through methods that were both necessary and inevitable. The pain that accompanied its application was welcomed as purification, the permanent scarring accepted as beautification, that marked her as belonging to an elite whose dedication exceeded anything that lesser beings could understand or achieve. Her activities as a Death Eater during this period revealed the full extent of her capacity for cruelty and her complete abandonment of any moral constraints that might have limited her effectiveness in pursuing Voldemort's goals. She participated in raids on Muggle communities that were designed not just to eliminate specific targets, but to create terror that would spread throughout non-magical society and demonstrate the futility of resistance to wizarding dominance. She tortured captured Order of the Phoenix members with techniques that were calculated to extract information while inflicting maximum psychological damage, understanding that broken enemies were more useful than dead ones in spreading fear among those who might otherwise consider opposing their inevitable victory. But perhaps most tellingly, she began to develop innovations in dark magic that impressed even Voldemort himself, creating new curses and magical techniques that enhanced the Death Eater's ability to spread suffering and chaos throughout their enemies' ranks. Her natural talent for combat magic, refined through years of study and practical application, had evolved into something approaching artistry in the application of pain and terror, as she learned to craft magical attacks that were tailored to exploit the specific fears and weaknesses of individual victims. Her relationship with her husband Rodolphus during this period became even more purely functional than it had been during their early married years, as both of them understood that their partnership was valuable primarily for the tactical advantages it provided in their service to Voldemort, rather than for any personal satisfaction or emotional fulfillment they might derive from domestic happiness. They worked together on missions that required coordination between multiple Death Eaters, shared intelligence and resources that enhanced their mutual effectiveness, and provided each other with alibis and cover stories that protected them from ministry investigations into their illegal activities. But Rodolphus also served as witness to the gradual transformation of his wife from someone who was merely committed to pure-blood supremacy into something that was barely recognizable as human, as her obsession with Voldemort consumed aspects of her personality that had once provided balance and perspective in her approach to achieving their shared goals. Her laughter became harsher, her anger more destructive, her pleasure increasingly dependent on the suffering of others, rather than the satisfaction of accomplishment or the joy of companionship. The other Death Eaters learned to approach her with the kind of cautious respect that was typically reserved for dangerous magical creatures whose behavior could not be predicted or controlled through normal methods of management or negotiation. Her reputation for creative cruelty and absolute loyalty to Voldemort made her valuable as a weapon, but dangerous as a colleague, since her willingness to sacrifice anything or anyone in service of their master's goals included fellow Death Eaters who might compromise mission success through incompetence or insufficient dedication. While Bellatrix was embracing her role as one of Voldemort's most trusted and feared lieutenants, her sister Narcissa was navigating the increasingly dangerous political landscape with the careful calculation that had always characterized her approach to complex situations where personal safety and family advancement had to be balanced against broader ideological considerations and social pressures. Her position as the wife of Lucius Malfoy provided her with access to information and influence that most pure-blood families could not achieve, but it also connected her to networks and activities that carried enormous risks if their true nature were discovered by ministry authorities or rival factions. Lucius's role as a Death Eater was more subtle and politically sophisticated than the crude terrorism that characterized Bellatrix's activities, focusing on infiltration of magical institutions and corruption of legal processes, rather than direct violence against specific targets. His wealth and social connections allowed him to influence ministry policies through bribes and favors that appeared to be legitimate business dealings, while his reputation as a respectable pure-blood citizen provided cover for activities that would have attracted immediate suspicion if undertaken by someone with a more obvious criminal background. But Narcissa understood that her husband's careful approach to supporting Voldemort's goals did not provide complete protection against the consequences of association with Death Eater activities, particularly as the war escalated and the ministry began to employ increasingly aggressive methods in their attempts to identify and capture those who were working to undermine magical society's stability. Her primary concern was ensuring that whatever happened to the broader Death Eater movement, her family's safety and prosperity would be preserved through careful planning and strategic positioning that maintained their options regardless of how the conflict ultimately resolved. Her relationship with her young son Draco became the central focus of her life during this period, as she understood that his future would be determined by the choices she and her husband made during these crucial years, when the foundation of the magical world was being contested by forces whose ultimate victory was far from certain. She supervised his education with obsessive attention to detail, ensuring that he learned not just the skills and knowledge appropriate for someone of his social position, but the flexibility and adaptability that would allow him to thrive regardless of which side emerged victorious from the coming struggle. But perhaps most importantly, she worked to shield him from the more extreme aspects of the pure-blood ideology that had shaped her own upbringing, understanding that the fanaticism that drove Bellatrix's devotion to Voldemort was both dangerous and potentially self-destructive in ways that could harm rather than help those who embraced it too completely. Her goal was to raise a son who would be able to function effectively in whatever magical society emerged from the war, whether it was dominated by pure-blood supremacists or forced to accommodate the more egalitarian ideals that were being promoted by their enemies. The third sister, Andromeda, found herself increasingly isolated and endangered as the conflict escalated, her marriage to a Muggle-born wizard, making her a target for Death Eater violence, while her pure-blood heritage created suspicion among Order of the Phoenix members, who could not be certain of her loyalty or reliability in situations where family connections might override ideological commitments. Her position was particularly precarious because her sister's activities on behalf of Voldemort made her vulnerable to guilt by association, even though she had been completely cut off from family communications since her marriage to Tonks. Her commitment to the values that had motivated her to reject her family's prejudices and marry for love rather than social advantage was tested daily by the reality of living in a society where such choices carried increasingly severe consequences for personal safety and economic security. Ted's work in the Muggle liaison office at the Ministry provided them with a modest but adequate income, but it also made him visible to Death Eaters, who were targeting Ministry employees whose loyalty to the existing magical government made them enemies of Voldemort's revolutionary agenda. Their daughter Nymphadora, now 6 years old, represented both the greatest joy and the most profound vulnerability in their lives. As Andromeda understood that the child's mixed heritage would make her a particular target for pure-blood extremists, who viewed such children as living symbols of the contamination and corruption that they were fighting to eliminate from magical society. The little girl's metamorph magus abilities, which allowed her to change her appearance at will, were already manifesting in ways that suggested enormous magical potential, but they also marked her as different in ways that could attract dangerous attention from people who viewed such unusual gifts with suspicion or envy. Andromeda's isolation from her birth family became complete during this period, as any contact with her sisters would have endangered both her own family's safety and compromised whatever protection their different positions might provide in the event that circumstances forced them into direct conflict. She followed reports of Death Eater activities with the horrified fascination of someone who recognized that her sister was probably involved in atrocities that challenged every assumption about human decency and moral limitation. But she could do nothing to intervene or influence events without exposing her own family to retaliation that would be swift and merciless. The escalation of violence throughout magical Britain during this period created an atmosphere of constant tension and fear that affected every aspect of daily life, as families struggled to maintain normal routines while preparing for attacks that could come at any time from enemies who might be neighbors, colleagues, or even relatives whose political allegiances had placed them on opposite sides of an increasingly brutal conflict. The Ministry's attempts to maintain order and protect innocent civilians were hampered by infiltration and corruption that made official responses slow and often counterproductive, while Voldemort's followers grew bolder in their attacks and more sophisticated in their methods of spreading terror and chaos. The torture and permanent incapacitation of Frank and Alice Longbottom marked a turning point in the war that demonstrated the complete abandonment of civilized restraint by Voldemort's most fanatical followers. As the attack was designed not just to punish specific enemies, but to send a message to anyone who might consider opposing Death Eater goals through official or unofficial resistance. The choice of targets was particularly significant, as the Longbottoms were respected auras whose dedication to protecting innocent people had made them symbols of everything noble about magical law enforcement, and defenders of the established order. Bellatrix's participation in this atrocity, along with her husband Rodolphus, his brother Rabastan, and Barty Crouch Jr., revealed the depth of her transformation from idealistic young pure blood into something that was barely recognizable as human in its capacity for inflicting suffering on helpless victims. The torture was conducted with systematic precision that demonstrated not just willingness to cause pain, but active pleasure in the process of destroying two people whose only crime had been their effective opposition to Death Eater activities and their refusal to abandon their posts despite increasing personal danger. The magical techniques they employed went far beyond the simple application of the Cruciatus Curse, incorporating methods that were designed to maximize psychological damage while keeping their victims alive to experience every moment of agony that could be inflicted without causing immediate death. They took turns, applying different forms of torture, studying their victims' responses, and adjusting their techniques to achieve maximum effectiveness in breaking down mental defenses and destroying the cognitive processes that allowed normal human consciousness to function. The hours of torture that reduced Frank and Alice Longbottom to permanent mental incapacity were conducted with the kind of methodical attention to detail that Bellatrix might once have applied to academic research or social advancement, as she discovered in the systematic destruction of human minds a form of artistic expression that satisfied psychological needs that normal activities could never address. Her laughter during the proceedings was described by witnesses as the most chilling sound they had ever heard, suggesting that she had found in the suffering of others a source of joy that transcended anything she had previously experienced. The capture and trial of the 4 Death Eaters responsible for this atrocity provided the magical public with their first clear view of how completely some pure-blood idealists had been transformed by their allegiance to Voldemort's cause, as the defendants made no attempt to deny their actions or express regret for the consequences of their choices. Instead, they used the courtroom as a platform for promoting their beliefs about pure-blood supremacy and the necessity of eliminating inferior beings from magical society, speaking with the confidence of people who believed that history would vindicate their methods even if contemporary opinion condemned their specific actions. Bellatrix's behavior during the trial was particularly striking, as she treated the proceedings not as a legal challenge to her actions, but as an opportunity to demonstrate her unwavering loyalty to Voldemort and her contempt for the magical institutions that were attempting to judge her according to standards that she considered irrelevant and illegitimate. She sat in the defendant's chair as if it were a throne, her posture conveying the message that she considered herself superior to everyone present, despite the evidence of her crimes and the certainty of her conviction. Her final statement before sentencing became legendary among both Death Eaters and their opponents for its complete rejection of any authority other than Voldemort's will, and its prediction that their current defeat was merely temporary setback in a struggle that would ultimately result in the triumph of pure-blood values and the elimination of those who opposed them. She spoke with the fervor of a religious prophet declaring inevitable salvation, her voice carrying across the silent courtroom with the kind of absolute certainty that was both inspiring to her supporters and terrifying to everyone else. The sentence of life imprisonment in Azkaban was received by the 4 defendants with reactions that revealed their different levels of commitment to their cause and their varying degrees of psychological stability after years of exposure to dark magic and extreme ideology. Barty Crouch Jr. appeared devastated by the prospect of indefinite separation from the master he worshipped, while the Lestrange brothers accepted their fate with the stoic resignation of soldiers who had always understood that capture was a risk inherent in their chosen profession. But Bellatrix's reaction was one of almost triumphant defiance, as she declared her absolute confidence that Voldemort would return to rescue his most faithful servants and reward them for their loyalty during his temporary absence from the struggle to transform magical society. Her final words, as she was led away to Azkaban, became a rallying cry for Death Eaters who avoided capture and a source of nightmares for their victims, as she promised that their suffering had only just begun and that worse was yet to come when their master returned with the power necessary to complete his work. The years that followed were marked by a gradual return to something approaching normalcy in magical society, as Voldemort's apparent defeat and the capture or elimination of most Death Eater leadership created space for ordinary wizarding life to resume patterns that had been disrupted by years of violence and terror. But for the families of those who had been directly affected by the war, the peace was incomplete and fragile, shadowed by losses that could never be fully healed, and knowledge that the forces which had created such devastation might still exist in forms that were hidden rather than eliminated. For Narcissa, the imprisonment of her sister and the apparent defeat of Voldemort's movement created both relief and anxiety, as she understood that while her family had avoided immediate consequences for their associations with Death Eater activities, their position remained precarious and could be threatened by any resurgence of interest in past connections and political allegiances. Her husband's successful claim that his participation in Death Eater activities had been the result of imperious curse compulsion rather than voluntary choice provided them with legal protection, but it also created obligations and limitations that would affect their future options and social relationships. The need to maintain the appearance of complete respectability while privately preserving resources and connections that might prove valuable if circumstances changed required careful balancing of competing priorities and constant attention to how their actions might be perceived by both former allies and potential enemies. They had to appear grateful for their second chance while avoiding any behavior that might suggest they had genuinely abandoned the beliefs that had motivated their previous choices, a performance that demanded exceptional skill in social manipulation and political positioning. Their son Draco's upbringing during this period reflected these complex requirements, as Narcissa worked to ensure that he received an education that would prepare him for success in whatever magical society might emerge from future conflicts, while avoiding exposure to ideas or influences that might compromise his safety or limit his options. He was raised with an understanding of pure blood superiority that was subtle rather than militant, taught to value his heritage without expressing contempt for others in ways that might create problems or attract unwanted attention. For Andromeda, the apparent end of the war brought a measure of security that she had not experienced since her marriage to Ted, as the reduction in Death Eater activity meant that her family was no longer in immediate danger of attack because of her husband's blood status or her own rejection of pure blood ideology. Their daughter Nymphadora was able to attend magical school and participate in normal childhood activities without the constant fear that had shadowed her early years, while Ted's position at the ministry became more secure as the government worked to rebuild institutions that had been weakened by infiltration and corruption. But the piece also brought knowledge about her sister's activities that was more detailed and disturbing than anything she had learned during the actual fighting, as testimony from trials and investigations revealed the extent of Bellatrix's transformation from idealistic young woman into something that was capable of torturing innocent people for pleasure rather than tactical advantage. The realization that someone who had once shared her childhood and family traditions could become so completely evil challenged assumptions about human nature and family bonds that had shaped Andromeda's understanding of the world and her place in it. The 14 years that Bellatrix spent in Azkaban prison were marked by a combination of physical deterioration and psychological intensification that would have destroyed lesser personalities but served to refine her fanaticism into something approaching pure essence of devoted service to her absent master. The Dementors that guarded the prison fed on the happiness and hope of inmates, but they found in Bellatrix something that was already so consumed by obsession that their influence served more to concentrate her remaining emotions than to eliminate them entirely. Her physical appearance was transformed by the harsh conditions and supernatural influences of Azkaban, as years of inadequate nutrition and constant exposure to despair carved away everything soft or attractive about her features, while leaving behind a gaunt intensity that was more frightening than her previous beauty had ever been. Compelling, but her magical power remained largely intact, sustained by the same obsessive will that had driven her to excel in dark magic, and protected by mental disciplines that allowed her to maintain focus and purpose, even in circumstances that reduced most prisoners to mindless suffering. More importantly, her time in Azkaban served to purify her devotion to Voldemort by eliminating all competing loyalties and concerns that might have diluted her commitment to his cause or limited her willingness to sacrifice anything in service of his goals. The isolation and suffering that broke other prisoners served to strengthen her conviction that her master represented the only source of meaning and purpose in a world that was otherwise filled with enemies and obstacles that existed only to be overcome or destroyed. Her husband Rodolphus and his brother Rabistan underwent similar transformations during their imprisonment, though neither achieved the same level of psychological concentration that characterized Bellatrix's response to their shared ordeal. They remained loyal to Voldemort and committed to pure blood supremacy, but their devotion was tempered by human limitations and personal concerns that prevented them from achieving the kind of absolute dedication that had become the defining characteristic of Bellatrix's personality. The magical world's gradual recovery from the trauma of Voldemort's first rise created an atmosphere of cautious optimism that was particularly evident in the new generation of children who grew up during the peaceful years, including Draco Malfoy and Nymphadora Tonks, whose parallel development reflected the very different values and expectations that had shaped their respective families' approaches to post-war life. But beneath the surface calm, the forces that had created the original conflict remained largely unchanged, waiting for circumstances that would allow them to emerge once again, in forms that might prove even more dangerous and destructive than their previous manifestations. The stage was being set for a second war that would test everything the three Black sisters had learned about loyalty, sacrifice, and the true cost of the choices they had made during their youth and early adulthood, conflicts that would force them to confront the ultimate consequences of their different interpretations of what their pureblood heritage meant and what obligations it created for those who possessed the power to shape the future of magical civilization. The summer of 1995 brought whispers of darkness returning to the wizarding world, though most of magical Britain remained willfully blind to the signs that those with eyes to see recognized as harbingers of a second war that would prove even more devastating than the first. The escape of 10 Death Eaters from Azkaban prison during a mass breakout that the Ministry dismissed as impossible had shattered the illusion of safety that 14 years of peace had carefully constructed, releasing back into the world individuals whose dedication to Lord Voldemort's cause had been refined by years of imprisonment into something approaching absolute fanaticism. Bellatrix Lestrange emerged from Azkaban transformed by her ordeal into a creature that was barely recognizable as the beautiful young woman who had entered that terrible fortress more than a decade earlier. The Dementor's influence had carved away everything soft or human about her appearance, leaving behind a gaunt spectre whose sunken cheeks and wild hair spoke of suffering that would have destroyed lesser minds, but had only served to concentrate her obsession with serving her master into its purest possible form. Her first sight of Lord Voldemort after 14 years of separation was a moment of religious ecstasy that transcended any joy she had ever experienced, as she fell to her knees before him, with tears streaming down her ravaged face, and proclaimed her unwavering loyalty, despite the years of torment that had been the price of her devotion. The Dark Lord's acknowledgement of her faithfulness, his recognition that she alone among his followers had never wavered in her belief in his inevitable return, validated every moment of suffering she had endured, and every sacrifice she had made in service of his greater vision. But the reunion also revealed how much both master and servant had been changed by their respective ordeals, as Voldemort's resurrection had transformed him into something that was no longer entirely human, while Bellatrix's imprisonment had stripped away the last vestiges of normal human emotion, and left behind only the burning core of absolute dedication that made her the perfect instrument for implementing his most extreme commands. They understood each other now in ways that went beyond mere shared ideology, connected by mutual recognition of what it meant to sacrifice everything human in pursuit of power and purpose that transcended individual limitations. Her husband Rodolphus and his brother Rabastan had also been freed in the mass breakout, but their reunion with Bellatrix was marked by the awkward recognition that their shared imprisonment had not created the same bonds of understanding that existed between her and Voldemort. They remained loyal Death Eaters and committed supporters of pure blood supremacy, but they lacked the absolute dedication that had sustained her through years of torment and emerged from Azkaban as damaged individuals rather than purified instruments of their master's will. The other escaped Death Eaters quickly learned that Bellatrix's position in Voldemort's inner circle had been elevated by her unwavering loyalty during his absence, as she was granted access to information and responsibilities that were denied to followers whose commitment was considered less absolute, or whose reliability had been compromised by their behavior during the years of apparent defeat. Her knowledge of advanced dark magic, enhanced by years of meditation and study, even in the hellish environment of Azkaban, made her valuable for missions that required both magical skill and complete disregard for conventional moral limitations. But perhaps most importantly, her obvious pleasure in inflicting suffering and her complete lack of empathy for victims made her the ideal instrument for Voldemort's campaign of terror that was designed not just to eliminate specific enemies, but to break the spirit of resistance throughout magical Britain by demonstrating that opposition to Death Eater goals would result in consequences so severe that most people would choose submission rather than face the possibility of becoming targets themselves. Her sister Narcissa watched these developments with a mixture of fear and calculation that reflected her understanding that Bellatrix's return to active service would inevitably complicate her own family's carefully maintained position of cautious neutrality in the growing conflict. The Malfoy family had spent 14 years rebuilding their reputation after Lucius's successful claim that his previous Death Eater activities had been the result of imperious curse compulsion, but Bellatrix's prominence in Voldemort's new organization would make it impossible to maintain the pretense that they were merely respectable pure-blood citizens with no connection to illegal activities or extremist politics. Lucius's response to Voldemort's return was immediate and complete, as he understood that attempting to maintain distance from Death Eater activities would be interpreted as disloyalty that could result in consequences far more severe than any legal penalties the Ministry might impose for acknowledged participation in the growing rebellion against established magical authority. His wealth and political connections made him valuable for financing Death Eater operations and corrupting Ministry officials, while his social position provided cover for activities that might otherwise attract unwanted attention from law enforcement agencies. But Narcissa recognized that her husband's renewed involvement with Voldemort's cause would inevitably expose their son Draco to dangers that she had spent 15 years trying to shield him from, as association with known Death Eaters would make him a target for both Ministry persecution and Order of the Phoenix retaliation, regardless of his own beliefs or actions. Her primary concern shifted from maintaining family social position to protecting her child from the consequences of choices that adults had made before his birth and that he was powerless to influence or escape. The mission to retrieve the prophecy from the Department of Mysteries represented the first major test of Voldemort's reconstituted Death Eater organization, and the first opportunity for the three Black sisters to confront each other as adults whose choices had placed them on opposite sides of an increasingly brutal conflict. The prophecy itself contained information about Harry Potter's role in Voldemort's eventual defeat, knowledge that the Dark Lord considered essential for planning his long-term strategy and eliminating the primary threat to his plans for transforming magical society. Bellatrix's participation in this mission revealed both her enhanced capabilities and the extent to which her imprisonment had intensified her commitment to Voldemort's cause beyond anything that could be called normal human loyalty. She approached the infiltration of the Ministry with the methodical precision of someone whose years in Azkaban had been spent planning exactly such operations, understanding that success would demonstrate her worthiness for greater responsibilities, while failure might result in punishment that would make her previous suffering seem trivial by comparison. The Department of Mysteries itself was a labyrinth of magical experiments and classified research that had been designed to confuse and disorient intruders. But Bellatrix navigated its corridors with the confidence of someone who had spent years studying every detail of Ministry security procedures and defensive enchantments. Her knowledge of dark magic allowed her to overcome obstacles that would have stopped less experienced infiltrators, while her complete disregard for legal consequences enabled her to use methods that more cautious Death Eaters might have avoided. The confrontation with Harry Potter and his friends in the Prophecy Chamber represented the first time that Bellatrix had faced young enemies who were fighting not for ideology or political advantage, but for the simple right to survive and protect those they loved. Their courage and determination reminded her uncomfortably of qualities she had once possessed, but had long since sacrificed in service of her master's greater vision, creating moments of doubt that she immediately suppressed through renewed focus on the importance of completing her assigned mission. But it was her encounter with her niece, Nymphadora Tonks, that truly revealed the depth of transformation that imprisonment had wrought in her character and worldview, as she found herself facing a young woman who shared her blood but had chosen to embrace everything that she had been raised to despise and destroy. Tonks represented the next generation of magical society, someone who had grown up believing that blood status was irrelevant to determining worth. and that magical ability should be used to protect rather than dominate those who were less powerful. The duel between aunt and niece was more than mere magical combat, but a confrontation between two completely different visions of what the magical world should become, as Bellatrix fought to preserve the pure blood supremacy that had shaped her entire understanding of right and wrong, while Tonks defended the inclusive society that represented everything hopeful and progressive about magical civilization's potential future development. Their curses clashed with the kind of elemental fury that was generated when irreconcilable worldviews were tested through direct conflict rather than theoretical debate. Bellatrix's victory over her niece was achieved through superior experience and complete willingness to use magic that was designed to cause permanent damage rather than temporary incapacitation, as she understood that mercy toward enemies was weakness that would be punished by Voldemort if it compromised mission success or allowed opponents to escape and fight again on future occasions. The spell that rendered Tonks unconscious was calculated to inflict psychological trauma that would reduce her effectiveness in subsequent encounters, while demonstrating to other Order members the futility of opposing Death Eaters who possessed both superior magical knowledge and absolute dedication to their cause. But her greatest triumph during the mission was her successful elimination of Sirius Black, her own cousin whose rebellion against family expectations had made him a symbol of everything that was wrong with magical society's drift toward equality and acceptance of inferior bloodlines. His presence in the Department of Mysteries as a member of the Order of the Phoenix represented the ultimate betrayal of pure blood values, as he had chosen to fight alongside Muggle-born wizards and blood traitors against his own family's legitimate interests and ancient privileges. Their duel was conducted with the kind of personal hatred that went beyond mere political disagreement into the realm of family honor and generational conflict, as Bellatrix saw in her cousin's opposition not just ideological difference, but active treason against everything their ancestors had built and preserved through centuries of careful breeding and strategic advancement. Her killing curse was cast with the satisfaction of someone who was correcting a fundamental error in the natural order, eliminating a source of contamination that had threatened to spread throughout their bloodline and corrupt future generations. The look of surprise on Sirius's face as he fell through the veil that separated the living world from whatever lay beyond death was an image that would sustain Bellatrix through whatever challenges awaited her in the continuing war. Proof that even the most rebellious members of pure blood families could be brought to account for their choices, and that justice would ultimately prevail regardless of temporary setbacks or apparent defeats. His death was not just tactical victory, but spiritual vindication of everything she believed about the importance of maintaining blood purity and the inevitable consequences of betraying family obligations. Her escape from the Department of Mysteries after the arrival of Dumbledore and additional Order reinforcements was accomplished through magical techniques that she had perfected during her years in Azkaban, where survival had depended on maintaining skills and knowledge that could be applied when opportunities for freedom finally presented themselves. The other Death Eaters who were captured during the mission lacked her dedication to continuous self-improvement and paid the price through imprisonment that would remove them from active service just when Voldemort's plans required maximum commitment from all his followers. But her confrontation with Harry Potter in the Ministry atrium revealed aspects of her character that even she had not fully understood, as she found herself facing a teenage boy whose magical abilities and moral clarity reminded her of everything she had once been before prison, and obsession had transformed her into something that was barely recognizable as human. His attempt to use the Cruciatus curse against her was simultaneously flattering and pathetic, demonstrating that he possessed the potential for dark magic, but lacked the emotional commitment necessary to make such spells truly effective. Her taunting of Potter about his failure to properly cast an unforgivable curse revealed her understanding that magical power without genuine hatred was merely technical exercise, rather than true expression of will and intention, while also providing her with opportunity to educate him about the realities of magical warfare that his sheltered upbringing had never prepared him to face. She took pleasure in explaining that effective use of dark magic required not just technical knowledge but emotional investment that most people were too weak or moral to achieve. The arrival of Voldemort himself in the Ministry atrium marked the culmination of her successful mission and the beginning of her restoration to the position of prominence within Death Eater hierarchy that her loyalty and sacrifice had earned through years of suffering and unwavering dedication. His acknowledgement of her effectiveness and his protection of her from Dumbledore's attempts at capture validated every choice she had made and every price she had paid in service of his greater vision for magical society. But perhaps most importantly, the mission demonstrated to both her master and her fellow Death Eaters that imprisonment had not weakened her commitment, but had refined it into something approaching perfect dedication, as she had proven herself willing to face any danger and overcome any obstacle in pursuit of objectives that served Voldemort's interests, rather than her own personal safety or advancement. Her position, as his most trusted lieutenant, was now unquestionable, based not just on ideological alignment, but on demonstrated performance under conditions that had tested every aspect of her capabilities. The aftermath of the Department of Mystery's mission created ripple effects throughout magical society that would influence every subsequent development in the growing war. As Voldemort's public appearance ended the Ministry's ability to deny his return and forced both sides to abandon subterfuge in favor of open conflict that would determine the future of wizarding civilization through direct confrontation rather than covert maneuvering. For the three Black Sisters, this escalation meant that their different choices would now be tested through circumstances that would leave no room for compromise or neutrality. Bellatrix's success in the mission elevated her to a position where she would be involved in planning and executing the most important Death Eater operations, while her demonstrated loyalty earned her access to information and resources that would make her one of the most dangerous enemies that the Order of the Phoenix would face during the coming conflict. Her knowledge of Ministry security procedures, her understanding of Order tactics and personnel, and her complete willingness to use any method necessary to achieve victory made her invaluable for operations that required both magical skill and absolute ruthlessness. Her relationship with Voldemort during this period transcended normal concepts of loyalty or service, evolving into something that resembled religious devotion more than political allegiance, as she found in his approval and recognition the only source of meaning and purpose that could justify the sacrifices she had made and the suffering she had endured. His presence in her life provided validation for choices that had cost her everything human and normal, while his confidence in her abilities gave her opportunities to prove herself worthy of the trust he placed in her judgment and capabilities. But the intensity of her devotion also created vulnerabilities that more perceptive enemies might eventually learn to exploit, as her need for Voldemort's approval made her behavior somewhat predictable, and her unwillingness to disappoint him could potentially be manipulated by opponents who understood the psychological dynamics that drove her actions. Her greatest strength as a Death Eater was also her most significant weakness as an individual, since her entire identity had become so completely merged with service to her master that she no longer possessed independent existence or personal goals that were separate from his agenda. The capture of her brother-in-law Lucius during the Department of Mystery's mission created additional complications for family relationships that were already strained by the different positions the sisters had taken in the growing conflict. As his imprisonment removed a moderating influence on Death Eater activities, while creating pressure on Narcissa to take more active roles in supporting operations that she might otherwise have preferred to avoid. The loss of the Malfoy family's political influence and financial resources also weakened Voldemort's ability to operate through legal channels and forced him to rely more heavily on direct action that increased risks for all his followers. But perhaps most significantly, Lucius's capture created an opportunity for Voldemort to punish the entire Malfoy family for failures that he attributed to insufficient dedication and inadequate preparation, as he understood that maintaining discipline among his followers required consequences that would discourage similar mistakes by others who might be tempted to prioritize personal safety over mission success. The task he eventually assigned to young Draco Malfoy would serve multiple purposes, testing the family's loyalty while providing practical benefits that would advance Death Eater goals regardless of whether the boy succeeded or failed in his assigned mission. For Narcissa, her husband's imprisonment and her son's endangerment represented the complete collapse of the carefully constructed life she had built around the assumption that intelligence and careful planning could provide security for her family, regardless of the broader political developments that were reshaping magical society. The choices she had made during her youth and early adulthood, which had seemed so reasonable and advantageous at the time, were now creating consequences that threatened everything she valued most and left her with options that were all dangerous and potentially destructive. Her sister Andromeda remained largely unaware of these family dramas, as her complete separation from pure-blood society had insulated her from direct involvement in Death Eater activities, while creating its own set of challenges and dangers that required constant vigilance and careful management. Her daughter's career as an Auror made the Tonks family a legitimate target for Death Eater retaliation, while Ted's position at the Ministry exposed him to risks that were increasing as Voldemort's influence spread throughout magical government institutions. The knowledge that her sister was once again active as a Death Eater and probably involved in the most brutal aspects of Voldemort's campaign created psychological burdens that Andromeda struggled to process, as she was forced to confront the reality that someone who had shared her childhood and family upbringing had chosen to embrace evil so completely that redemption seemed impossible. The theoretical possibility that circumstances might force her to choose between protecting her own family and preventing her sister from harming innocent people created moral dilemmas that she preferred not to contemplate but could not entirely ignore. Her daughter's increasing involvement in Order of the Phoenix activities brought both pride and terror, as Andromeda recognized that Tonks possessed the courage and magical ability necessary to make significant contributions to the fight against Voldemort, but also understood that such service would inevitably expose her to dangers that could result in consequences too terrible to contemplate. The knowledge that her daughter might eventually face her aunt in combat was particularly disturbing, as it represented the complete breakdown of family bonds that had once seemed unbreakable despite ideological differences. The war that was now beginning in earnest would test every assumption about loyalty, sacrifice, and the true meaning of family that the three Black sisters had developed during their lives, forcing them to confront ultimate questions about what they were willing to sacrifice in service of their beliefs and what prices they were prepared to pay to protect those they loved. The choices they had made during their youth had seemed final and irreversible, but the coming conflict would reveal that even the most fundamental decisions could be challenged by circumstances that demanded responses nobody had anticipated or prepared for. The stage was now set for confrontations that would determine not just the outcome of the war, but the ultimate fate of each sister and the legacy they would leave for future generations who would inherit whatever magical society emerged. From the crucible of conflict that was about to test every institution and relationship that had previously provided stability and meaning in the wizarding world. The autumn of 1997 marked the beginning of the most terrible period in Narcissa Malfoy's carefully constructed life, as the consequences of her family's association with Lord Voldemort's cause finally overwhelmed the protective barriers of wealth, social position, and political influence that she had spent decades building around those she loved most. The humiliation began with Voldemort's commandeering of Malfoy Manor as his primary headquarters, transforming her elegant home into the nerve center of a terrorist organization whose activities violated every principle of civilized behavior that her upbringing had taught her to value and respect. The Dark Lord's presence in her ancestral home was not a request but a command that could not be refused without consequences that would extend far beyond mere inconvenience or social embarrassment, as Voldemort made clear through subtle demonstrations of power that revealed the complete helplessness of even the wealthiest pure-blood families when confronted by magical force that acknowledged no legal or moral constraints. The rooms that had once hosted elegant dinner parties and sophisticated political discussions were now filled with Death Eaters, whose crude manners and violent tendencies created an atmosphere of barely controlled chaos that made normal family life impossible. But the physical occupation of her home was less devastating than the psychological assault that accompanied it, as Voldemort took obvious pleasure in humiliating the Malfoy family through public demonstrations of their reduced status and his absolute authority over every aspect of their existence. The dining room where she had once entertained the most influential members of magical society became the setting for Death Eater meetings, where her family's failures were discussed with the kind of casual contempt normally reserved for discussing the incompetence of house elves or the disappointing performance of poorly trained animals. The most painful moment in this systematic degradation came when Voldemort chose to mock her family's blood status by referencing her sister Andromeda's marriage to a Muggle-born wizard and her niece's subsequent marriage to a werewolf, connections that he presented as evidence of contamination that had spread throughout the Black bloodline despite their supposed commitment to pure-blood supremacy. His words were chosen with surgical precision to inflict maximum psychological damage while demonstrating to his assembled followers that even the most ancient and respected families could fall from grace if they failed to meet his phase. Standards of absolute loyalty and unwavering service. The theft of Lucius's wand represented the final symbol of her husband's complete subjugation, as Voldemort claimed the elegant instrument that had been crafted specifically for the Malfoy heir, as a casual demonstration of his authority over every aspect of their lives and possessions. The wand had been more than mere magical tool, but a symbol of family heritage and personal identity that connected Lucius to centuries of ancestors who had wielded similar instruments in service of causes they considered worthy and noble, making its confiscation a violation that transcended mere practical inconvenience to become spiritual assault on everything he understood about his place in the magical world. Her son Draco's transformation from pampered heir to reluctant assassin was perhaps the cruelest aspect of Voldemort's punishment. As the impossible task of killing Albus, Dumbledore was designed not to succeed, but to destroy the boy's innocence while providing the Dark Lord with a method of torturing the entire family through their shared helplessness to protect their most precious member from consequences that were both inevitable and terrible. The mission was calculated to exploit Narcissa's greatest vulnerability, while demonstrating to other Death Eater families the futility of placing personal loyalty above absolute commitment to their master's agenda. Watching her 16-year-old son struggle with magical and psychological burdens that would have challenged, experienced adult wizards, created a form of suffering that went beyond anything Narcissa had previously experienced, as she was forced to maintain appearances of normalcy, while knowing that every day brought her child closer to either committing murder that would destroy his soul or facing execution for failing to complete his assigned task. The careful education and sheltered upbringing that she had provided to prepare him for a life of privilege and influence had become liabilities that left him completely unprepared for the reality of serving a master who viewed his followers as expendable resources rather than valuable allies. Her decision to seek help from Severus Snape represented a desperate gamble that revealed the depth of her love for her son and her willingness to risk everything to protect him from consequences that his own choices and his family's past associations had made seemingly inevitable. Snape's position as a double agent within Voldemort's inner circle made him potentially valuable as an ally, but it also made any association with him dangerous in ways that could compromise her family's safety if his true loyalties were discovered by the wrong people at the wrong time. The meeting with Snape at Spinner's End, conducted in the presence of her sister Bellatrix, created dynamics that revealed the complex web of relationships and conflicting loyalties that characterized Death Eater operations during this period, as three individuals with very different motivations and priorities attempted to navigate circumstances that could prove fatal for all of them if handled incorrectly. Narcissa's desperation to protect her son, Bellatrix's fanatical devotion to Voldemort, and Snape's hidden agenda created tensions that made honest communication impossible, while demanding cooperation that could only be achieved through careful manipulation and strategic deception. Bellatrix's suspicion of Snape's loyalty reflected her understanding that Voldemort's organization was filled with individuals whose commitment to the cause was compromised by personal considerations that might lead them to betray their master if circumstances made such betrayal advantageous or necessary. Her years of imprisonment had taught her to recognize the signs of duplicity and divided loyalty that marked those who were serving multiple masters or pursuing hidden agendas that conflicted with official Death Eater objectives, making her valuable as a detector of potential treachery, but also dangerous to anyone whose motives were not entirely pure. The unbreakable vow that Snape agreed to make represented the ultimate test of his claimed loyalty to Voldemort's cause, as the magical binding would result in his death if he failed to honor his commitment to protect Draco and ensure the success of his mission against Dumbledore. The ancient ritual created connections between the participants that went beyond mere promise or oath to establish magical compulsion that could not be broken without fatal consequences, making it the most serious form of magical commitment that could be undertaken between wizards who understood the implications of such binding. But for Narcissa, the vow represented hope that her son might survive the impossible situation that Voldemort's punishment had created, as Snape's magical binding to protect and assist Draco provided resources and expertise that might make the difference between success and failure in accomplishing a task that seemed designed to ensure the boy's destruction. Her willingness to participate in the ritual demonstrated her understanding that conventional methods of protection and assistance would be inadequate against the forces that threatened her family, making desperate measures not just acceptable, but necessary. The months that followed were marked by increasing tension and fear, as Draco struggled to repair the vanishing cabinet that would allow Death Eaters to infiltrate Hogwarts, while Narcissa lived with the constant knowledge that her son was attempting something that would either result in his transformation into a murderer or his death as punishment for failure. The reports she received about his progress were fragmentary and often contradictory, filtered through sources whose reliability was questionable and whose own safety might be compromised if their communications were discovered by school authorities or Order of the Phoenix members. Her sister Bellatrix's involvement in the final assault on Hogwarts created additional complications for family relationships that were already strained by conflicting loyalties and competing priorities, as the mission that was supposed to demonstrate Draco's worthiness for Death Eater membership instead became a collaborative effort that revealed his limitations, while providing adult Death Eaters with opportunities to prove their own dedication through successful completion of objectives he could not achieve independently. The presence of experienced killers like Bellatrix transformed what was meant to be a test of individual capability into a group operation whose success would reflect shared credit rather than personal accomplishment. The night of Dumbledore's death marked both the successful completion of Draco's assigned mission and the beginning of a new phase in the war that would expose every member of the Malfoy family to dangers and moral compromises that their previous careful neutrality had been designed to avoid. The headmaster's murder, though accomplished by Snape rather than Draco directly, satisfied Voldemort's requirement for mission completion, while binding the entire family more closely to Death Eater activities through their complicity in planning and supporting the operation that had made such assassination possible. But the victory was shadowed by recognition that Dumbledore's death would remove the most significant obstacle to Voldemort's complete domination of magical Britain, creating conditions that would make resistance increasingly difficult while exposing everyone associated with Death Eater activities to retaliation from opponents who would no longer be constrained by the headmaster's preference for mercy and rehabilitation over justice and punishment. The protection that Dumbledore's presence had provided to both sides in the conflict would be lost, replaced by circumstances that would demand increasingly extreme measures from everyone involved. The summer of 1997 brought the complete collapse of any pretense that the war could be fought through conventional political or military means, as Voldemort's influence spread throughout the Ministry of Magic and other magical institutions with the speed and efficiency that could only be achieved through years of careful infiltration and strategic preparation. The fall of the government created conditions where Death Eater policies could be implemented through legal channels, while resistance activities became criminal offenses that could be punished through official law enforcement agencies, rather than clandestine operations. The establishment of the Muggle-born Registration Commission represented the beginning of systematic persecution that would eventually extend to every category of wizard or witch whose blood status or political beliefs made them targets for elimination or forced conversion to Death Eater ideology. The Commission's work was presented as administrative necessity for maintaining accurate records of magical ability and ensuring that stolen magic was returned to its rightful owners. But its true purpose was creating legal justification for policies that would eventually result in the enslavement or murder of significant portions of the magical population. For Andromeda and her family, the new policies created immediate and existential threats that could not be avoided through careful political maneuvering or strategic neutrality, as Ted's Muggle-born status made him a primary target for persecution, while their daughter's position as an Auror made them vulnerable to retaliation from Death Eaters who viewed law enforcement officers as enemies of the new regime. The comfortable life they had built during the years of peace was destroyed overnight, replaced by circumstances that demanded constant vigilance and careful planning for survival in a world where their very existence had become illegal. Ted's decision to go into hiding rather than report for registration represented recognition that compliance with Death Eater demands would result in imprisonment or worse, while resistance offered at least the possibility of survival until circumstances changed or help became available from sources that were currently unknown or inaccessible. The separation from his wife and pregnant daughter was agonizing but necessary, as remaining together would have made all of them easier targets for capture, while reducing their collective chances of surviving the persecution that was now being conducted with the full authority of corrupted magical law. Andromeda's position during this period was particularly precarious, as her pure blood status provided some protection from official persecution, while her family connections made her vulnerable to pressure from Death Eaters, who might attempt to use her as a source of information about Order of the Phoenix activities, or as bait for trapping her husband and daughter when they attempted to maintain contact with her. Her isolation in the family home, while surrounded by neighbors whose loyalties were unknown and whose behavior might be influenced by fear or opportunism, created psychological stress that was compounded by worry about family members whose safety she could not ensure or even verify. The birth of her grandson Teddy Lupin during this period of maximum danger represented both joy and additional vulnerability, as the child's mixed heritage made him a target for Death Eater policies, while his werewolf father's initial abandonment created practical problems that left Andromeda responsible for supporting her daughter through the physical and emotional challenges of new motherhood under impossible circumstances. The baby's safety required constant vigilance and careful planning, as his unusual magical heritage would make him valuable for experimental purposes if he were captured by Death Eaters who were interested in studying the effects of lycanthropy on magical development. Her daughter's commitment to Order of the Phoenix activities, despite the personal risks involved, created conflicts between Andromeda's desire to protect her family and her recognition that the fight against Voldemort's regime was necessary for creating a world where her grandson could grow up with freedom and dignity rather than persecution and fear. The knowledge that Tonks was regularly engaging in combat with Death Eaters, who might include her own aunt, created psychological burdens that were almost impossible to bear, as the theoretical possibility of family members killing each other had become a practical concern that influenced every decision about safety and strategy. Meanwhile, Bellatrix's position as one of Voldemort's most trusted lieutenants provided her with opportunities to participate in the most brutal aspects of the Death Eater campaign, while demonstrating her worthiness for even greater responsibilities through creative applications of dark magic and innovative approaches to spreading terror throughout the magical population. Her years in Azkaban had refined her natural sadism into something approaching artistic expression, as she learned to craft psychological and physical torments that were tailored to exploit the specific fears and weaknesses of individual victims. Her role in the systematic persecution of Muggle-born wizards revealed the depth of her commitment to pure blood supremacy and her complete abandonment of any moral constraints that might have limited her effectiveness in implementing policies designed to eliminate inferior beings from magical society. She approached the work with the same methodical precision that she had once applied to academic subjects, understanding that success required not just willingness to inflict suffering, but strategic thinking about how individual acts of cruelty could contribute to broader goals of social transformation. But perhaps most significantly, her position within Voldemort's inner circle provided her with insights into his long-term plans and psychological state that revealed the extent to which his resurrection had changed him in ways that made him both more powerful and more unstable than he had been during his first rise to power. His increasing paranoia about betrayal and his growing tendency to punish failure with extreme violence created an atmosphere of constant fear among his followers, that made effective coordination difficult, while encouraging the kind of competitive cruelty that served his purposes, even when it interfered with practical mission objectives. The trust that Voldemort placed in Bellatrix was based not just on her demonstrated loyalty, but on his recognition that her psychological damage made her incapable of the kind of independent thinking that might lead to betrayal or rebellion, as her identity had become so completely merged with service to his cause that she no longer possessed personal goals or desires that might conflict with his agenda. She had become the perfect servant, valuable precisely because she was no longer entirely human in her capacity for moral reasoning or emotional attachment to anything beyond her master's approval. Her assignment to guard one of his Horcruxes represented the ultimate expression of trust, as the magical objects that contained portions of his soul were the most precious possessions he had created, and their destruction would result in permanent damage to his immortality that could not be repaired or replaced through any known magical means. The responsibility required not just physical protection of the artifact, but understanding of its magical properties and significance that was shared only with his most trusted inner circle members. But the trust also created additional pressure to prove herself worthy of such responsibility through successful completion of missions that tested every aspect of her capabilities while demonstrating her continued value to the Death Eater cause and her unwavering commitment to Voldemort's vision for magical society. The knowledge that failure would result in consequences more severe than mere death created motivation that was both empowering and psychologically destructive, as she understood that her master's displeasure could extend to forms of punishment that would make her previous suffering seem pleasant by comparison. The escape of Harry Potter, Ron Weasley, and Hermione Granger from Malfoy Manor after their capture by Snatchers represented one of the most significant failures in Death Eater operations during this period, as the three teenagers had been within moments of being delivered to Voldemort when a combination of house elf magic and desperate heroism allowed them to disapparate with information and magical artifacts that would prove crucial for the continuing resistance to Death Eater rule. The incident revealed weaknesses in Death Eater security procedures, while demonstrating that even the most carefully planned operations could be compromised by factors that were difficult to anticipate or control. Bellatrix's interrogation of Hermione Granger during the Manor incident revealed both her expertise in torture techniques and her growing instability under the pressure of maintaining absolute loyalty while dealing with the constant psychological stress of constant violence and moral compromise. Her reaction to discovering that the prisoners had somehow gained access to her Gringotts vault was immediate and extreme, reflecting her understanding that the loss of artifacts stored there could compromise Voldemort's security in ways that would result in punishment that exceeded anything she had previously experienced. The torture was conducted with the systematic precision that had characterized her previous work, but it was also marked by a desperation and fury that suggested her psychological state was becoming less stable under the accumulated stress of years of violence and the constant pressure to exceed her previous achievements in service of increasingly impossible standards of performance. Her pleasure in inflicting suffering was now accompanied by anxiety about the consequences of failure that created internal tensions, threatening to compromise her effectiveness as both interrogator and operational leader. The successful escape of the prisoners represented not just tactical defeat but personal humiliation that would require explanation to Voldemort, and could result in consequences that would affect not just her own status, but the safety of her sister's family whose home had been used for the failed operation. The knowledge that house elf magic had been used to overcome Death Eater security measures was particularly galling, as it suggested that their assumed superiority over magical creatures was based on arrogance rather than actual capability. The incident also revealed the continuing importance of family connections in determining Death Eater behavior and decision-making, as Narcissa's intervention to protect Hermione from potentially fatal torture demonstrated that maternal instincts could sometimes overcome ideological commitment when circumstances forced choice between abstract principles, immediate, practical concerns. Her argument with Bellatrix about appropriate treatment of prisoners reflected deeper disagreements about methods and objectives that had been developing as the war progressed and the costs of victory became increasingly apparent. The growing tension between the two sisters reflected not just different approaches to implementing Death Eater policies, but fundamental disagreements about what they were trying to achieve and what prices they were willing to pay for success in their shared cause. Narcissa's primary loyalty remained with her family rather than abstract ideology, while Bellatrix's devotion to Voldemort had become so complete that she viewed any consideration for personal relationships as weakness that compromised mission effectiveness and demonstrated insufficient commitment to their master's vision. These differences would become increasingly important as the war approached its final phase and circumstances forced both sisters to make choices that would determine not just their own survival, but the legacy they would leave for future generations who would inherit whatever magical society emerged from the crucible of conflict that was testing every institution and relationship that had previously provided meaning and stability in the wizarding world. The prices they had paid for their different interpretations of loyalty and duty were becoming apparent, while the ultimate costs remained to be determined through battles that would spare neither the innocent nor the committed in their demand for final resolution of conflicts that had divided magical Britain for decades. The final battle that would determine the fate of Wizarding Britain began not with the clash of armies or the thunder of competing magics, but with the quiet infiltration of Hogwarts Castle by three figures whose presence within those ancient walls represented the convergence of family bonds and ideological warfare that had torn the magical world apart for nearly 2 decades. Lord Voldemort's demand that Harry Potter surrender himself had created the conditions for a confrontation that would force every witch and wizard to choose between resistance and submission, between the values that had sustained magical civilization for centuries and the vision of pure blood supremacy that promised order through domination and peace, through the elimination of all opposition. For the three Black sisters, the Battle of Hogwarts would represent the final test of choices they had made during their youth and the ultimate reckoning for paths they had followed despite the costs to family relationships and personal happiness. Their presence on the battlefield would be determined not by abstract political principles, but by the most fundamental human motivations: love, hatred, fear, and the desperate desire to protect what mattered most when everything else had been stripped away by years of conflict and moral compromise. Bellatrix arrived at Hogwarts as one of Voldemort's most trusted lieutenants. Her position in his inner circle, earned through years of unwavering loyalty and demonstrated willingness to commit atrocities that had tested the limits of human cruelty and magical possibility. Her years in Azkaban, followed by her devoted service during his second rise, had transformed her from a beautiful young pureblood into something that was barely recognizable as human, her gaunt features and wild hair marking her as someone who had sacrificed everything normal and decent in pursuit of an ideology that demanded absolute commitment from its adherents. Her anticipation of the coming battle was marked by a savage joy that transcended mere political satisfaction, as she understood that victory would vindicate every sacrifice she had made and every price she had paid in service of her master's vision for magical society. The destruction of Hogwarts as a symbol of the inclusive education that had allowed Muggle-born students to learn alongside their pure-blood betters would represent the beginning of a new era where magical ability would be M7, properly channeled according to blood status and social hierarchy, rather than wasted on those who lacked the breeding necessary to use such gifts responsibly. But beneath her fanatical enthusiasm lay a deeper satisfaction that was more personal than political, as the battle would provide her with opportunities to eliminate enemies who had opposed her family's legitimate interests and challenged the natural order that should have elevated pure bloods to positions of undisputed authority over magical civilization. The presence of Order of the Phoenix members within the castle meant that she would finally have the chance to settle accounts with individuals who had caused her personal inconvenience and professional embarrassment through their stubborn refusal to acknowledge their obvious inferiority. Her magical preparations for the assault reflected years of study and innovation in dark arts techniques that had been refined through practical application during countless missions that had tested her creativity and dedication to achieving results that served Voldemort's broader strategic objectives. The curses she had prepared were not mere weapons, but artistic expressions of her commitment to pure blood supremacy, designed to inflict suffering that would serve as education for any survivors who might be tempted to continue resistance after witnessing the consequences of opposing Death Eater authority. The enchantments on her robes and accessories provided protection against the most common defensive spells, while enhancing her natural magical abilities in ways that would give her significant advantages over opponents whose commitment to civilized restraint made them reluctant to employ the most effective techniques available for magical combat. Her wand, 11 inches of walnut with a dragon heartstring core that had served her faithfully since her Hogwarts years, had been enhanced through rituals that connected it more closely to her magical core while imbuing it with properties that made her curses more powerful and her defensive spells more resilient. But perhaps most importantly, she carried with her the absolute confidence of someone who had never doubted the righteousness of her cause, or questioned the necessity of methods that lesser souls might consider excessive or morally questionable. Her years of service to Voldemort had taught her that victory belonged to those who were willing to pay any price and sacrifice anything in pursuit of their goals, while defeat was the inevitable fate of those who allowed conscience or compassion to limit their effectiveness when circumstances demanded absolute commitment. Narcissa's presence at the battle was motivated by considerations that were entirely different from her sister's ideological fanaticism, as her primary concern remained the safety and survival of her family, rather than the success of Death Eater political objectives or the implementation of pure-blood supremacist policies. Her husband's release from Azkaban had been contingent upon the family's continued cooperation with Voldemort's plans, while her son's position within Death Eater ranks made neutrality impossible and resistance potentially fatal for all of them. But her participation in the assault was also shaped by recognition that the outcome of this battle would determine what kind of world her family would inhabit for the remainder of their lives, as defeat would likely result in imprisonment or execution for all Death Eater supporters, regardless of the level of their individual commitment or the nature of their specific contributions to the cause. Victory offered the possibility of restoring the Malfoy family's social position and political influence, while defeat promised only destruction and disgrace that would extend to future generations. Her magical abilities, though considerable, were focused on protection and preservation rather than destruction and domination, reflecting a personality that had always preferred strategic maneuvering to direct confrontation and careful planning to impulsive action. The spells she had prepared were designed primarily to keep her family alive and together, rather than to eliminate specific enemies or advance particular tactical objectives, though she understood that circumstances might force her to take more aggressive action if their survival depended upon it. The wand she carried had been crafted specifically for defensive magic, its 13-inch length and unicorn hair core providing stability and reliability that were more valuable for protective spells than the raw power that characterized weapons designed for offensive combat. Her robes were warded with enchantments that would deflect most curses while providing concealment that could allow her family to escape if the battle turned against Death Eater forces, while her jewelry contained emergency portkeys that could transport them to safe locations if immediate evacuation became necessary. But her most important preparation was psychological rather than magical, as she had spent months developing contingency plans that would allow her to adapt to whatever circumstances the battle might create while maintaining her primary focus on protecting her son, regardless of the broader political implications of her choices. Her loyalty to Voldemort was conditional and pragmatic rather than absolute and emotional, based on calculation of what would serve her family's interests, rather than genuine belief in the superiority of pure-blood ideology or the necessity of eliminating inferior beings from magical society. The third sister was present not as a Death Eater, but as a defender of everything that Death Eater ideology sought to destroy. Her commitment to the Order of the Phoenix, representing the culmination of choices she had made during her youth, when she chose love over family loyalty and moral principle over social advantage. Nymphadora Tonks had inherited her mother's courage and moral clarity, while adding to them the professional skills of an aura whose training had been specifically designed to combat the kind of dark magic that Death Eaters employed as their primary weapons. Her presence at Hogwarts was motivated by recognition that this battle would determine whether her infant son would grow up in a world where his mixed heritage was celebrated as evidence of magical diversity or persecuted as contamination that threatened the purity of wizarding bloodlines. The policies that Voldemort had already implemented through his control of the Ministry demonstrated what Death Eater victory would mean for families like hers, while the alternative offered hope that equality and justice might eventually replace hierarchy and prejudice as the organizing principles of magical society. Her magical preparations reflected years of Auror training that had been enhanced by Order of the Phoenix experience in combating Death Eater techniques and tactics, as she understood that victory would require not just courage and determination, but strategic thinking and technical expertise that could match or exceed what their enemies brought to the confrontation. Her spells were chosen for maximum effectiveness against dark magic practitioners, whose abilities had been refined through years of illegal research and practical application in situations where failure meant death or worse. The Metamorph Magus abilities that marked her as unique among magical beings provided tactical advantages that conventional combat training could not duplicate, as her capacity to alter her appearance and physical characteristics allowed for deception and misdirection that could confuse enemies while creating opportunities for surprise attacks that might otherwise be impossible to achieve. Her natural hair color had been abandoned in favor of the bright pink that served as both personal statement and practical camouflage, making her instantly recognizable to allies while declaring her rejection of the conformity that Death Eater ideology demanded from all members of magical society. But perhaps most importantly, she carried with her the moral authority of someone who had chosen to fight for principles larger than personal safety or family advantage, understanding that some battles were worth dying for regardless of the personal costs involved or the probability of success against overwhelming opposition. Her commitment to the Order's cause was based not on hatred of enemies but on love for the inclusive society that victory would make possible, while her willingness to sacrifice her life was motivated by determination that future generations would inherit a world where worth was determined by character rather than bloodline. The battle itself began with magical bombardments that shattered the ancient stones of Hogwarts while filling the air with curses that had been designed to kill, maim, and terrorize anyone unfortunate enough to be caught in their paths. The protective enchantments that had defended the castle for centuries proved inadequate against weapons that incorporated innovations in dark magic developed during years of experimentation by Death Eaters whose commitment to victory exceeded any concern for the collateral damage their methods might inflict on innocent bystanders or historical treasures. But the defenders had advantages that Death Eater planners had not fully anticipated, as the castle itself seemed to come alive in defense of values that had been nurtured within its walls for nearly 1,000 years of continuous operation as an institution dedicated to magical education and the development of young witches and wizards, according to their individual talents rather than their family backgrounds. The moving staircases rearranged themselves to confuse invaders while providing escape routes for defenders. The portraits coordinated to provide intelligence about enemy movements, and even the suits of armor animated themselves to join the fight against forces that threatened everything Hogwarts represented. The first direct confrontation between the three Black Sisters occurred in the entrance hall, where Bellatrix encountered her niece Tonks during the initial assault on the castle's interior defenses. The duel that followed was more than mere magical combat, but a clash between two completely different visions of what the magical world should become, as aunt and niece faced each other across a divide that had been created by choices made during their respective childhoods, and could only be resolved through violence that would eliminate one perspective or the other. Bellatrix approached the combat with the savage enthusiasm that had characterized all her Death Eater activities, understanding that her niece represented everything corrupted and unnatural about modern magical society's drift toward equality and inclusion, rather than hierarchy and exclusion. The young woman's very existence was an affront to pure blood values, while her choice to fight for the Order demonstrated the kind of traitorous behavior that required elimination rather than rehabilitation or forgiveness. But Tonks fought with the desperate courage of someone who understood that defeat would mean not just personal death, but the triumph of ideology that would make her son's life impossible and transform magical Britain into a place where love was subordinated to blood status and individual worth was determined by ancestry rather than character. Her spells were cast with the precision that came from years of professional training, while her metamorph magus abilities provided tactical advantages that her aunt's superior experience in dark magic could not entirely overcome. The duel raged through corridors that had been carved by centuries of student footsteps and filled with echoes of laughter, learning, and friendship that Death Eater victory would replace with the silence of fear and the rigid conformity that their ideology demanded from all members of magical society. Their curses shattered ancient portraits and demolished furniture that had served generations of Hogwarts students, while their movement through the castle created a trail of destruction that symbolized the broader conflict between preservation and transformation that was being fought throughout magical Britain. But experience and absolute ruthlessness eventually overcame youth and moral restraint, as Bellatrix's willingness to use curses that were designed to cause maximum suffering gave her advantages that her niece's oral training had not fully prepared her to counter. The killing curse that ended Tonks's life was cast with the satisfaction of someone who was correcting a fundamental error in the natural order, eliminating a source of contamination that had threatened to spread throughout magical society if allowed to continue influencing others through her example of successful resistance to pure blood supremacy. The death of her daughter-in-law represented a personal tragedy for Andromeda that transcended the political implications of Death Eater victory, as she lost not just a beloved family member, but the primary connection between her isolated household and the broader struggle for justice and equality that was being fought throughout magical Britain. The knowledge that her own sister had been responsible for the murder created psychological wounds that would never fully heal, while the practical consequences left her solely responsible for raising a grandson whose mixed heritage would make him a target for persecution regardless of which side ultimately prevailed in the larger conflict. But Tonks' sacrifice was not meaningless, as her death served to inspire other defenders while demonstrating the human cost of resistance to Death Eater goals that helped clarify what was at stake in the broader battle for the future of magical civilization. Her final spell, cast even as she fell, disrupted Death Eater formations in ways that created opportunities for other Order members to advance their positions and achieve tactical objectives that might otherwise have been impossible to accomplish. The climactic confrontation between Bellatrix and Molly Weasley represented the collision between two different forms of maternal devotion, as the Death Eater's fanatical commitment to her master's ideology was challenged by the protective fury of a mother whose children had been threatened by forces that acknowledged no moral boundaries and respected no innocent lives. The duel began when Bellatrix's killing curse barely missed Ginny Weasley, creating a moment of mortal danger that transformed Mrs. Weasley from grieving mother into avenging angel, whose determination to protect her remaining children exceeded any concern for personal safety or conventional limitations on appropriate feminine behavior. The battle that followed was conducted with magical intensity that exceeded anything previously witnessed during the night's fighting, as both combatants understood that defeat would mean not just personal death, but the triumph of values that were antithetical to everything they considered sacred and worthy of preservation. Bellatrix fought with the accumulated skill and knowledge of someone who had spent decades perfecting dark magic techniques while serving a master whose approval was more important to her than life itself, while Molly drew upon reserves of power that were enhanced by maternal love and righteous anger at the suffering that Death Eater activities had inflicted upon innocent families throughout magical Britain. But the outcome was determined not by technical expertise or magical power, but by the fundamental difference between love and hatred as motivating forces, as Bellatrix's devotion to destruction was ultimately overwhelmed by Molly's commitment to protection and preservation of everything good and decent about magical civilization. The killing curse that ended the Death Eater's life was cast not from hatred, but from love that was powerful enough to overcome even the most sophisticated dark magic when circumstances demanded such extreme measures for defending the most innocent. Bellatrix's final moments were marked by surprise rather than fear, as she had never seriously considered the possibility that someone like Molly Weasley could possess the magical ability or emotional commitment necessary to defeat a Death Eater whose experience and training had been specifically designed for eliminating opponents who lacked the ruthlessness necessary for victory in magical combat. Her expression as she fell revealed recognition that she had underestimated the power of protective love, while overestimating the effectiveness of destructive hatred as weapons in conflicts that were ultimately decided by moral rather than magical factors. Her death represented the end of the purest expression of Death Eater ideology within the Black family, as she had been the only sister whose commitment to pure blood supremacy had been complete and unwavering from childhood through the final battle. Her transformation from beautiful young pureblood into fanatical killer had been the logical result of beliefs that demanded absolute dedication while promising rewards that could only be achieved through the elimination of everyone who represented alternative visions of how magical society should be organized and governed. Voldemort's scream of rage upon witnessing her death revealed the depth of attachment he had formed to someone whose devotion had been so complete that it had transcended normal human relationships to become something approaching religious worship. Her loss deprived him not just of his most effective lieutenant, but of the only person who had ever provided him with something resembling emotional satisfaction, while demonstrating that even his most loyal followers were mortal and vulnerable to defeat by opponents who possessed sufficient motivation and moral authority. The aftermath of Bellatrix's death created opportunities for other participants in the battle to achieve objectives that her presence had made impossible, as her elimination removed both a tactical obstacle and a psychological symbol that had represented Death Eater invincibility and the futility of resistance to their goals. Her reputation for creative cruelty and absolute loyalty had made her valuable for terrorizing opponents, but it had also made her a target for concentrated opposition from defenders, who understood that her death would have symbolic importance beyond its tactical implications. Meanwhile, Narcissa's crucial decision to lie to Voldemort about Harry Potter's death represented the ultimate triumph of maternal love over political loyalty, as her determination to find and protect her son exceeded her concern for Death Eater victory or her fear of consequences that would result from betraying the master she had served through necessity rather than genuine devotion. Her whispered conversation with Harry in the Forbidden Forest revealed the psychological transformation that had been occurring throughout the battle, as circumstances forced her to choose between abstract ideology and immediate family welfare. Her recognition that Harry was still alive created an opportunity for betrayal that could serve her family's interests while potentially determining the outcome of the entire war, as Voldemort's belief that his primary enemy was dead would make him vulnerable to surprise attacks, while providing her with the chance to enter Hogwarts as part of the conquering army and locate her son before the fighting resumed. Her decision to deceive her master represented the final abandonment of any pretense that her loyalty to Death Eater goals was based on genuine belief rather than practical necessity. The lie she told was delivered with the same calm precision that had characterized all her social and political maneuvering throughout her adult life, as she understood that success required not just courage to deceive, but acting ability sufficient to convince someone whose magical perception exceeded normal human capabilities, and whose suspicion of betrayal had been heightened by years of governing through fear and intimidation. Her performance was flawless because it was motivated by maternal desperation that gave her access to emotional resources that abstract political commitments could never have provided. But her betrayal was also made possible by Voldemort's own limitations as a leader and strategist, as his inability to understand love as a motivating force prevented him from recognizing that someone might choose family loyalty over ideological commitment when circumstances forced such choices upon them. His assumption that all his followers shared his own emotional emptiness and single-minded focus on power made him vulnerable to deception by those whose humanity remained intact despite their association with Death Eater activities. The final phase of the battle saw Narcissa and Lucius desperately searching for their son, while abandoning any pretense of continuing to fight for Death Eater victory, as their realization that the war was lost combined with their determination to preserve their family unit, regardless of the political consequences of such apparent desertion from their assigned duties. Their flight through the Great Hall during the climactic confrontation between Harry Potter and Voldemort represented the complete collapse of their commitment to pure-blood supremacy in favor of basic survival instincts that transcended abstract ideology. Their survival and subsequent reconciliation with post-war magical society was made possible partly by Narcissa's crucial assistance to Harry Potter during his moment of greatest vulnerability, as her lie about his death had provided him with the opportunity to survive and ultimately defeat Voldemort in final combat that determined the future of magical civilization. Her betrayal of Death Eater interests in favor of family welfare had served broader purposes that she had not anticipated or intended, demonstrating how personal choices could influence historical outcomes in ways that exceeded their immediate tactical implications. The end of the battle brought different forms of resolution for each surviving sister, as Narcissa faced the challenge of rebuilding her family's reputation and social position after years of association with Death Eater activities, while Andromeda confronted the task of raising her grandson without the support of parents who had died in service of opposing sides in the conflict that had torn magical Britain apart. Their survival represented different forms of victory and defeat, as both had paid enormous prices for choices they had made during their youth, while discovering that family bonds could transcend ideological differences when circumstances demanded such transcendence. The legacy of their sister Bellatrix would be remembered as a cautionary tale about the dangers of fanaticism and the ultimate futility of hatred as an organizing principle for human society, while serving as a reminder that even the most privileged backgrounds and excellent educations could not prevent the moral corruption that resulted from embracing ideology that demanded the sacrifice of individual conscience in service of abstract principles. Her death had been necessary for victory, but tragic in its demonstration of how completely a human being could be transformed by beliefs that promised meaning and purpose while demanding the abandonment of everything that made life worth living. The three sisters had begun their lives with shared advantages and similar opportunities, but their different responses to the choices that defined their generation had led them to very different fates that reflected the broader consequences of the ideological conflicts that had shaped magical Britain during the late 20th century. Their story was both personal tragedy and political allegory, demonstrating how individual decisions could influence collective outcomes while revealing the ultimate importance of love over hatred, understanding over prejudice, and hope over despair as guiding principles for building societies that were worthy of the sacrifices made by those who defended them against the forces of darkness and destruction. Rest peacefully now, dear listener, as this tale of three sisters reaches its gentle conclusion. In the quiet of this magical evening, let the story of Bellatrix, Andromeda, and Narcissa remind you that we are not bound by the circumstances of our birth, but by the choices we make. When tested by life's great challenges, one sister chose the darkness of fanatical devotion. Another chose the light of love over loyalty to blood. And the third found redemption in a mother's protective instinct. Their story teaches us that family ties, however strong, cannot dictate the path of the human heart. In your dreams tonight, may you find the courage of Mad-Eye Moody, the wisdom of eternal vigilance, and the peace that comes from understanding that some battles, once fought with honor and sacrifice, keep us all safe forever. Sweet dreams, and remember, constant vigilance is the price of peaceful slumber in chambers protected by those brave enough to pay it. Sleep well, knowing that somewhere in the magical world, someone keeps watch in the tradition he established. And in your dreams, may you find the courage to choose love over hatred, understanding over prejudice, and hope over despair. Sweet dreams, and may your rest be filled with the peace that comes from knowing that love, in the end, conquers all.